Chapter 15 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 15. Miss Vale Departs Suddenly. For a moment there was a silence between the two men. Then Ashton Kirk said, dryly: "Miss Vale has, apparently, not been altogether frank with us in this matter." "You think, then," began Pendleton in a voice of terror. But Ashton Kirk stopped him. "I think many things," said he, "but they are neither here nor there. Facts are what count. Put the circumstances together for yourself and see where they lead you. Miss Vale has been, from the first, mixed up more or less in this crime. She explained. As far as I knew, the explanation was made in good faith. Now we find her here, in this lonely place, quietly engaged with a man whom I have convinced myself is one of Hume's murderers." There was another pause. This time it was Pendleton who broke the silence. "As you say," spoke he, in a strange, throaty sort of tone, "she has not been quite frank. Take all the circumstances together, and they seem to point—" He paused as though quite unable to finish. Ashton Kirk laid a hand upon his shoulder. "Imagination is a thing that is vitally necessary in this sort of work," said he. "But it must be held in check by reason. The great trouble with an amateur is that he reasons up to a certain point. Then he allows his imagination to take a long leap toward a result. The upshot is that his results have seldom anything to support them. The correct method, I think, is to allow the imagination to scurry ahead in the way that is natural to it. But reason must follow close behind, proving each step of the way. To be sure, you may have theories, hypotheses, ideas without end, but you must never take them for granted. Select each in its turn. Place it in a tube, as the chemist does. Add a few drops of reason, and you may produce a fact. It is the only way to go about it. Once a man becomes fixed in a belief, be there ever so little foundation for it, his mind stops revolving the subject. Further procedure is hopeless." "I understand all that well enough," said Pendleton. "But," and he waved his hand toward the house, "what does this mean?" "I don't know," said Ashton Kirk, "and neither do you. So, that being the case, there is but one thing to do. Find out." They gazed toward the window once more. Miss Vale had apparently mastered the contents of the paper, and was now engaged in writing rapidly. As the young men watched, she stopped, read carefully what she had written, and then handed it to Locke. The mute carried the paper to the light, and holding it very near to his eyes, read it with much attention. Then he tore it to strips, placed it upon the red coals of a stove which stood near him, and watched it burn. Facing Miss Vale, his fingers began to fly rapidly in intricate signs. This only lasted a moment, however, for he stopped, gestured passionately, seized a pad of paper, and began to write. While he was thus engaged, Ashton Kirk said to Pendleton in a low tone: "Remain here for a moment." Then, slowly, carefully, the investigator made his way toward the window through which Miss Vale and Locke were to be seen. Heavy beams of light shot across the ground from the windows, but here and there were trails of shadow. He clung to these until he had reached the shelter of the walls. Then, to Pendleton's amazement, he stepped directly in front of the window through which the two were to be seen, rapped smartly upon the glass, and remained standing in full view of the two in the room. Pendleton saw the pad drop from Locke's hands. He saw the mute wheel as he felt the vibrations and stare at the window, his eyes puckered and straining. He also saw Miss Vale rise, saw her hands thrown out in a gesture much like despair. And also he heard the cry that she uttered, muffled by the confines of the room, but full of fear. Then the room was plunged into darkness. An instant later a door was heard to open. The sound of quick moving feet came to him. There followed the pulsations of a motor and the racing of a car away into the night. "She's off," breathed the young man, and there was undoubted relief in the knowledge. "She's off, and I really believe that's what Kirk was after." He walked toward the house and found his friend standing in the shadows. "Well," chuckled the investigator, "it did not take her long to make up her mind, eh?" "You had some motive in doing that," accused Pendleton. "What was it?" Ashton Kirk was about to reply, but just then the small figure of Locke made its appearance. He carried a lantern and was approaching with stumbling steps, his eyes peering and blinking in their efforts to pierce the gloom. Not until he was well upon the two did he make them out. Then he halted, lifted the light above his head, and surveyed them intently. In the rays of the lantern, Ashton Kirk smiled urbanely and bowed. The supple fingers of the mute writhed inquiringly. "Each of them forms itself into a wild note of interrogation," said Pendleton. "They are fairly screaming questions at you." Ashton Kirk smiled even more agreeably at Locke, and shook his head. Then he went through the pantomime of one writing, and finished by pointing to the house. Carefully, eagerly, fearfully, the mute examined them. His near-sighted eyes and the wavering light must have made it all but impossible for him to make them out. However, he at length motioned for them to follow him, and started back by the way which he had come. But after a few steps he halted. He indicated that they were to remain where they were. Then he went to the shed-like building, closed the door and locked it, placing the key in his pocket. "It would seem," observed Ashton Kirk, "that we are not to be trusted implicitly." "Also," replied Pendleton, "that there is something of value in the shed." Returning, Locke led the way to a door upon the other side of the house. Showing them into a small room, furnished with books and scientific apparatus, and evidently a study, he set down the lantern and with a sign bade them be seated. Upon their doing so, he produced a small pad of paper and a pencil. Handing these to Ashton Kirk, he stood peering at them expectantly. With the swift, accurate touch of an expert, the investigator wrote in the Pitman shorthand: "We ask pardon if we have startled you." Then he tore off the sheet and handed it to Professor Locke. The man seemed surprised at the medium selected by his visitor. Nevertheless, he quickly traced the following in the same characters: "Who are you? What is your errand?" "We were sent to you by Dr. Mercer," replied Ashton Kirk with flying pencil. "Our business is to secure the admission of a new pupil." Locke read this and regarded them for a moment doubtfully. "Why did you not press the button at the door?" he demanded in writing. "I hardly expected you to have such a thing as a bell," answered Ashton Kirk, on the pad. "And so, seeing you, I attracted your attention as best I could." Professor Locke read this and stood with his pencil poised, when the buzzer sounded harshly. He went at once into the hall. They heard him open the door, and in a few moments he returned, followed by Haines. The fingers of the two flashed their signals back and forth. Then a look of relief came into Locke's face. He even smiled and nodded understandingly at the two young men. "I beg pardon, gentlemen," said Haines, "but when I got back to the hall, Dr. Mercer made me return and make sure that you had got to see the professor." "Thanks," replied the investigator. "We had not the slightest difficulty." "I'm glad to hear it, sir. said the man. "Good night to you." He flashed the same wish to the mute, who answered readily. Then he went out, and through the window they saw his light again go bobbing away in the darkness. Then the professor began to write once more. "I beg your pardon," was his message in longhand. "The man tells me that it was quite as you say. But I must confess I was a trifle startled." "The lady," wrote Ashton Kirk, "seemed startled, too." For the fraction of a moment the mute halted in his reply. Then the pencil, with much assurance, formed the following: "It was my niece. She was about to go just as you came, so do not reproach yourself for having driven her away." For some time the penciled conversation continued between the two; but as it was all based upon the fanciful pupil whom the investigator stated he desired to place in Dr. Mercer's care, Pendleton paid little heed to it. At last, however, they bid the professor good bye, and left him upon the threshold, his massive head nodding his adieus, his frail little body sharply outlined by the glow from the hall. The two had reached their own car around on the other road before Pendleton spoke. Then he inquired: "Well, have you learned anything from him?" "I think I can say yes to that," answered the other. "But I'm not yet sure. I'll have to put it to the proof first, according to the formula which I gave you a half hour ago. If it succeeds, I'll tell you what it is. If it does not, I'll say nothing, and it will go upon the scrap heap devoted to broken fancies. And now, Dixon," to the chauffeur, "we'll go home." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 16. Steel against Steel. Shortly before noon next day, Ashton Kirk, in an immaculate morning suit, was ushered into the presence of Miss Edyth Vale. If he expected confusion, embarrassment, or anything of that sort, he was disappointed, for she greeted him eagerly and with outstretched hand. "This is a surprise," she said. He held her hand and looked meaningly at her. "My appearances are sometimes surprising," he said. "But I usually select the night for them. The effect is better then, you see." She smiled into his eyes. "I have no doubt but that you are dreadfully mysterious," she said. "But please sit down." She seated herself near the window. Holding a book in her hand, she fluttered the leaves to and fro. "The composure," thought the investigator as he sat down, "is somewhat overdone." "I wonder," said Miss Vale, looking at the book, "if you are an admirer of Ibsen." And as he nodded, she proceeded with a slight smile. "I know that he is scarcely the usual thing for a spring morning, but there are times when I simply can't resist him." "He's a strong draught at any time," said Ashton Kirk. "But his tonic quality is undoubted." "His disciples claim that for him, at any rate," she answered. "But sometimes I question its truth. Where is the tonic effect of Rosmersholm? I think it full of terrors." She shuddered and added, "The white horses will haunt me for weeks." "It's the atmosphere of crime," said he. That quiet home on the western fjords reeks with it." She made a gesture of repulsion. "It's ghastly!" she exclaimed. "And yet one feels it from the very first, before a word is spoken. Imagine Rebecca at the window, watching through the plants to see if Rosmer uses the footbridge from which his wife once leaped to her death." She paused a moment, her eyes upon the open pages. Then, lifting her head, she asked, "What do you think of Rebecca?" "A tremendous character, of wonderful strength. It was just such proud, dark, purposeful souls that Byron delighted to draw. But the only one in literature to whom I can fully liken her is the wife of Macbeth. There was the same ambition, the same ruthless will, the same disregard of everything that stood in her way. And, like Cawdor's wife, she weakened in the end." She regarded him fixedly. "Would you call it weakness?" she asked. "She fell in love with Johannes, did she not? That was weakness for her. She herself recognized it as such." The girl looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. "That is true," she said. "Some of the world's most daring and accomplished criminals have been women," he went on. "But nature never intended woman to be the bearer of burdens. There is a weakness in her soul structure somewhere. She usually sinks under the consciousness of guilt." "More so than men, do you think?" "As a rule, yes." She put down the book and clasped her hands in her lap. "There is no need to sympathize with Rebecca," she said. "She was brave and strong, even in her love for Johannes. But he," and there was a note in her voice that recalled the night he had listened to it over the telephone, "he was different. There is no more dreadful thing in the play to me than the character of Rosmer. To think of him sitting quietly in that charnel house, prospering in soul, growing sleek in thought, becoming stored with high ideas. Perfect peace came to him in spite of the stern-faced portraits which shrieked murder from the walls. He dreamed of freeing and ennobling mankind. And all the time, fate was weaving a net about him that was to drag him from the mill bridge after his dead wife." "Kroll knew him," said the investigator. "And he said Rosmer was easily influenced. It is usually men of that type who are drawn into the vortex which swirls at every door." Her face was a little pale, but she now arose with a laugh and began rubbing her fingertips with a handkerchief. "I think we'd better remove the dust of the Norwegian," she said. "And I make a vow never to read him again in the morning." She stood looking down at her caller good humoredly, and continued, "I suppose it is my fault, but you have a dreadfully gloomy expression. Or maybe," as an afterthought, "you ate an unwholesome dinner last night. Were you at the Parings by any chance?" He shook his head, his keen eyes searching her face. "No," said he. "I had much more important matters on hand." She held up her hand. "It was something about this Hume affair," she said. "Yes," he replied. The smile was now gone. She leaned back against a heavy table, her fingers tightly clasping its edge. "I have been trying to forget that dreadful thing," she said. "I've stopped looking at the papers because I would be sure to see it mentioned. And," with never a faltering in her eyes, "because I might be reminded of it in some other way, I now remain indoors." "Last night was an exception, perhaps," suggested he, smoothly. "Last night?" There was a questioning look in her beautiful eyes. The finely posed head with its crown of bright hair bent toward him inquiringly. An expression of chagrin crept into his face. "You were not out last night, then?" said he. "What makes you think so?" Smilingly. "It was dreadfully dull here, too. But then," with a shrug, "anything is better than a constant reminder of that Christie Place affair." He nodded understandingly. "I suppose it is very distressing." He frowned gloomily at the tips of his shoes, and she could see that he bit his lip with vexation. After a moment or two, he said: "It's very strange, but I was quite sure I saw you last night." "Yes?" Her tone was one of careless interest. "However," he went on, "I had but a glimpse of the lady, and could easily have been mistaken." He wore a baffled look, but smiled as he got up. "And," said he, "my visit of this morning was based upon the sight I fancied I had of you last night." She laughed amusedly. "It was something interesting," she said. "Please tell me about But no, no," hastily. "If it has anything to do with the Hume case, I'd rather not hear it." She had pressed the bell call for the footman when he said: "Mr. Morris still keeps himself well concealed, I note." Like a tigress leaping to defend her young, she met the accusation. "Mr. Morris has done no wrong," she declared, spiritedly, "and there is no need of his concealing himself." "Of course I will not say as to that." His voice was soothing and low. "But he makes a mistake in not coming forward. His name, you have noticed, has already appeared in the papers in direct connection with the murder." He glanced at her keenly once more. "It may be that he has gone away upon some urgent business," she said, "and the chances are that he has not heard anything of the matter." "If he had gone away on business, don't you think he would have mentioned it to someone?" "Perhaps he did not think it necessary. And again, maybe he did not expect to be gone so long. Such things frequently happen, you know." "They do," admitted Ashton Kirk. "But in the case of Allan Morris, they somehow fail to fit. I am convinced that he is in hiding." She regarded him steadily for a moment. Then she said: "You are convinced, you say?" "I am." "May I ask upon what your conviction is based?" "Not now, no." There was another pause. The man was at the door, ready to show the investigator out. "Perhaps," and her tone was very low, "you even fancy that you know his hiding place." "Not just yet," said he. "But in a few hours at most, I will." Her lips formed the good bye as he stood in the doorway, but she made no sound. And Ashton Kirk, as he walked down the hall, smiled quietly to himself. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 17 What Happened on the Road. About half an hour after Ashton Kirk had left the Vale mansion, a Maillard car drew up before the door. As it did so, an Italian laborer arose from the curb not far away, where he had been comfortably seated with his back against a tree. Then, throwing his arms wide in a luxurious yawn, he started leisurely down the street. 5 minutes later, a veiled, dust-coated female figure descended the step. The driver of the Maillard was dismissed, and Miss Vale composedly took his place at the wheel. As the car started forward, the gauntleted hands guided it firmly. The steady eyes were set straight ahead as the lever was pushed first to one speed and then another. And as the rapid pulse of the motor was borne along the quiet avenue, the Italian laborer calmly appeared from around a corner, pushing a powerful-looking motorcycle before him. Another moment, and the machine was sounding its wild fusillade. The Italian sped away in the same direction as the Maillard, his battered soft hat set jauntily upon the back of his head, his gay-colored neckerchief streaming in the wind. The car kept to the avenue for a long time, but finally, in the far suburbs, it made a sharp turn to the left, and a few miles further on shot into a broad highway that ran parallel with the railroad. Bending forward so as to offer the least resistance to the wind, the Italian's swarthy face relaxed at this. His fine white teeth showed in a smile. "Cordova, I think," muttered he, in very good English. "If not, then somewhere very near to it." Once upon the highway, which was hard, level and practically deserted, the Maillard increased its speed. Eddies of dust curled in its wake. Its hum resembled that of a gigantic top. Its shining brass and smooth gloss made it look like a streak of light. But the motorcycle was of the best. Its compact, powerful mechanism answered bravely to each call that was made upon it by the dark-faced man in the saddle. Its explosions had merged into one long volley. At a small and not very firm-looking bridge, the Maillard slowed down. Apparently for the first time, Miss Vale heard the cycle in the rear, for she turned and gave it a quick look. But the dust of her own progress hung thickly in the air, and she could not see very clearly. Passing the bridge at a low rate of speed, she turned again. The dark face of the rider, his battered hat and flying kerchief seemed to satisfy her. For once more she gave attention to her course, and again the car increased its speed. A mile or two further on, there was a rather broken stretch of road, and she was forced to slow down. As the sound of her own vehicle diminished, she, as before, caught the volleying of the motorcycle. And as she turned, the eyes that looked through the veil were intent and searching. This time she appeared not so well satisfied, for upon reaching the end of the broken stretch, she drew her car to one side and stopped. As the hammering explosions of the motorcycle grew plainer and plainer, she sat rigidly erect upon her seat, her face turned directly ahead. But a close observer would have noted a slow movement of her right hand among the folds of the dust coat. And, if he was also an experienced observer, he would have immediately understood that Miss Vale did not venture alone and unarmed upon the road. However, the Italian never even gave her a glance as he came up. His machine flew by with a swirl, amid a crashing crescendo. Then it disappeared in the dust of the distance. But Miss Vale, when she once more resumed her journey, had not gone much more than a mile when she came upon the same swarthy son of the South and his vociferous machine. But the latter was now silent enough. It leaned against a fence, and its rider knelt beside it, a wrench in his hand, testing its parts carefully and intently. The Maillard was less than a quarter of a mile away when Miss Vale caught the rapid series of explosions once more. With a quick glance ahead, she threw the lever forward, and the car tore along at a breathless rate. Fences ran by in a giddy, staggering line. Trees seemed to merge into one tangle of branches. The dust arose in solid towers behind her. However, she held to this but a scant 5 minutes. Her breath was short when she decreased the power. The hands upon the wheel shook a little, but her head was held erect. Her face was still purposefully set forward. Above the decreasing hum of her car came the swift, brave shocks of the motor cycle. But if there was a dread that fell to tightening at her heart, she showed it little. The Maillard still bore swiftly on. She did not once turn her head. A little further on there came into view a post with a series of white pointing signboards that indicated a crossroads. When still 100 yards from this, the car stopped once more. Again the Italian flew by. Again he vanished, this time around a bend beyond the crossroads. But once hidden by the bend, he stopped and got down. The smile again appeared upon his face. The brilliant teeth shone good-naturedly. "A simple little ruse," he said to himself, "and one that I've seen used with effect more than once. Evidently Miss Vale has her wits about her." Leaning against his machine, he waited and listened. From around the bend came the slow sound of the Maillard. Nearer and nearer it came for a time. Then it began to recede. At this the Italian remounted. The explosions of his motor were muffled as he went swiftly along upon the way by which he had come. At the crossroads he slowed up and examined the ground. Deep in the dust was the broad impress of the tires, showing the car to have taken the turn to the left. Then, swiftly, the cycle turned into the same road and took up the trail once more. Some 3 miles further on, the track veered back toward the highway along a badly cut dirt road. "Slow going for a heavy car," said the pursuer calmly. "It will not be long before I sight it again." There was a hard, beaten footpath at one side of the road. Taking to this, the man on the motorcycle found it easy traveling enough. Shortly after, he caught the laborings of the Maillard as it made its way through the binding ruts. Then he slowed down and ran easily along the path, content, apparently, to keep in sound of the chase. But upon finally reaching the highway, he increased his speed until he sighted the dust of the car. This he hung to like a beagle, but never once allowed the car itself to come into view. At last the sounds of the Maillard ceased, and the pall of dust thinned and dissolved itself in the air. The motorcycle ran swiftly on until the car, now at a standstill, became visible. Then the Italian got down, took out a pair of field glasses, and swept the highway before him. What he saw must have satisfied him that there would be no more use for his machine for a time, at least. For he pushed it to a place where there was a break in a fence and concealed it behind a musty-looking corn shock left from the fall before. Then, placing the glass under his arm, he walked guardedly along the road in the direction of Miss Vale's car. Some distance further on, there was a tall swamp maple growing by the roadside. It was an easy task to mount into its branches from the top fence rail. Then, resting snugly in a high fork, he leveled his glass and proceeded to scan the scene before him. Miss Vale had descended from her car. Her veil was raised, and she was gingerly picking at the mechanism with hands sheathed in canvas gloves. With apparent intentness, she took out tools. Small parts were inspected minutely. And yet, for all that, there was something unusual in her manner. Every now and then she would lift her head, casually so it seemed, and glance away across the fields. "And always to the right," murmured the man in the treetop, after a little. At once the big glass swept around in that direction. "A house," added the watcher, with great satisfaction. The building was almost buried in a thick growth of trees. Its white sides and red roof shone in the sun through branches abud with April. Suddenly, in the midst of her labor, Miss Vale paused. Her manner changed. The tools were dropped. The parts lost interest. Facing the house, she yawned, with arms thrown wide after the manner of one much wearied with a task. Then she took off the gloves, unpinned her hat, and smoothed her hair. This was gone through with careful elaboration, and afterwards there was a pause. The girl then gathered up the things, got into the machine, placed the hat upon the seat beside her, went careening away with never a backward glance. But the man in the tree seemed in no haste to follow. Instead, he covered the distant house with his glass and waited patiently. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed, then half an hour, and finally an hour. At the end of that time, however, a figure emerged from the trees about the house and walked hastily toward the road. The eyes of the watcher glistened, his fine teeth shone in an appreciative smile. Reaching the road where the car had stopped, the newcomer, who was young, well dressed, and rather good looking, suddenly paused, stopped, and lifted something from the ground. He held in his hands the work gloves of Miss Vale, which she had dropped after taking them off. For a moment the young man stood looking at them, as though hesitating what to do. Then he turned, went to the roadside, and placed them carefully upon the top rail of the fence. Then, trudging along on his way, he unsuspectingly passed beneath the maple which concealed the man with the glass. When he was out of sight, the Italian slipped down the tree and ran lightly along the road to the place where the gloves lay. He took up one and looked within, but it was empty. However, in the thumb of the next was a slip of paper which bore a single line of writing: Tobin Rangnow. Studying this for a moment, the Italian made a copy of it. Then he slipped it back into the thumb of the glove and replaced both exactly as they were. After which he made his way back to the motorcycle, and mounting, went flying toward the city. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 18. Ashton Kirk tells why. It was about 4 in the afternoon, and young Pendleton sat in Ashton Kirk's big chair, reading the newspapers and waiting. Finally, he rang a bell, and Stumph gravely appeared. "Are you sure that he said 3?" asked Pendleton. "About 3, sir," replied the man. "Oh, I suppose he's been detained, then. That will be all, Stumph." When the man disappeared, Pendleton lighted a cigar and resumed his reading. The Hume case was still holding its place as the news feature of the day. Nothing had occurred to equal it in sensation, and the huge headings flared across the front pages, undiminished and undismayed. "Why," screamed the Standard in a perfect frenzy of letterpress, "did Miss Edyth Vale visit Hume on the night of the murder?" The girl's name had crept into the paper on the day before. With each edition it appeared in larger type, and that afternoon the Standard was printing it in red ink. Allan Morris was not neglected. On the contrary, he figured a very close second to his betrothed in the types. "Where is Allan Morris?" One paper asked this question perhaps 50 times on each page. It peered at one in square, heavy-faced type from the bottoms of columns and between articles. There were interviews with his clerks. The opinions of his stenographer were given in full, together with her portrait, and what his manservant had to say was treated as being of great consequence. Another sheet, which made a point of appealing to the tastes of the vast foreign element of the city, grew very indignant as to the arrest of Antonio Spatola. "Why," it inquired, "is this man detained and no attempt made to take those higher up into custody? If the police department is so ready to incarcerate a poor musician, why should it hesitate upon the threshold of the rich man's mansion? Or the rich woman's, for the matter of that?" This item incensed Pendleton beyond measure. He threw the paper aside and stormed up and down the room. "Of all the blatant, wretched twaddle I ever did read," he exclaimed, "this is positively the worst. Why, the rag would have the police arrest Edyth. Arrest her for—" "Well," demanded a sharp, aggressively pitched voice, "what for you making the blame, eh? The cops pincha Spatola, and for why, eh? Because he's the wop, Maraghini, the Dago, and got no friends." At the first word, Pendleton had whirled about in astonishment and faced the speaker, who stood in the doorway, pointing with one hand in the attitude of melodrama. "Well," asked the young man, "who the deuce are you?" By way of an answer, the other burst into a laugh that showed his brilliant teeth. Then he threw off his battered soft hat and gaily colored handkerchief, after which he sank into the chair which Pendleton had lately vacated. "Pen," said he in an altered voice, "if you appreciate my friendship at all, give me one of the blackest cigars in the case over there." Pendleton stared for a moment. Then a grin crept over his face, and he said, "Oh, it's you, is it?" He went to the cabinet and took out a box. "Here's a brand that looks like Black Havana," he said. "And now, what the dickens are you doing in that rig?" "I've been taking a long ride in the country, on a motorcycle," answered Ashton Kirk, crossing his shabbily clothed legs and striking a match. "Any time you feel disinclined to face your meals, Pen, I recommend you heartily to do the same. It is a great bracer. At this moment I really believe I could do complete justice to even the very best culinary thoughts of our friend Dr. Mercer." Pendleton sat down and regarded his friend with questioning eyes. "It wasn't to acquire an appetite that you made up this way. You've been working. Ashton Kirk comfortably blew one smoke ring through another before he answered. "Will you be surprised to hear that I have been following Miss Edyth Vale on a little voyage to the neighborhood of Cordova?" "Again?" But this time she did not pay a visit to Professor Locke. Today the favored one was Allan Morris.
Morris. Then she knows where he is.
So it would seem.
But she told you the other day that she did not."
Ashton Kirk shrugged his shoulders. "Things happen swiftly and unexpectedly," said he. "Perhaps she did not know it then."
"And perhaps she did not know Locke or his whereabouts either," said Pendleton with bitter irony.
"Who knows?" replied Ashton Kirk composedly. "At any rate, it was just a supposition that led to my labors of today."
"I don't think I understand,"
said Pendleton after a moment. "Last night," said the investigator, "you asked me if I had learned anything from Professor Locke, and I replied to the effect that I thought I had. Now," after a pause devoted to the grateful smoke, "when one sees a girl circumstanced as Miss Vale assuredly is in this case, paying a secret visit to a man who is rather more than suspected of the murder, what does one suppose?"
"That she is leagued with him somehow,"
replied Pendleton, reluctantly. "Exactly. But on the other hand, when the same girl, upon sight of us, rushes off and leaves the man to face us without giving him a hint as to who we are, what does one suppose?" But Pendleton rose gloomily and strode over to the window.
"I don't know,"
said he. "One supposes," proceeded Ashton Kirk, "that she has not much interest in him." Here Pendleton faced about again. "If she had been leagued with him, as you put it, you may be sure that she would have managed to warn him in some way as to our identity. But that she had not done so, the mute's manner told me as plainly as words could have done. Seeing this, I began figuring what it meant. If she was not associated with Locke in the crime, why was she there? Immediately came the answer: through Morris. But when I saw her last, she denied any knowledge of Morris's whereabouts. Then I reasoned she had seen him in the interim."
"That's it!"
cried Pendleton, as he stepped forward and slapped the table with his palm.
"That's it beyond a doubt. He's managed to get word to her. She's seen him. He's told her all or part of the truth, and once more she's trying to help him. Why, Kirk, I'll venture to say,"
hot with indignation,
"that she was led to visit this little scoundrel Locke last night much as she was led to visit Hume's place on the night of the murder, completely in the dark, and merely with some sort of a vague notion of protecting Morris."
"Perhaps you are right, but I can't exactly say. But that she has seen Morris, I have made quite sure."
"How?"
"Last night, when I appeared at Locke's window, I established a reason for calling upon her this morning. Also I laid a foundation for what followed. Before the call I made certain preparations for a quick change of front." With a gesture that called attention to his costume, "In our conversation, I managed to tell her that Morris's hiding place was discovered. Then I left. As I expected, she at once called her car and set off to warn him, and I followed close behind upon the motor cycle."
"I see. I see. And did you get sight of him?"
Ashton Kirk nodded. Then he proceeded to relate the story of the noonday run to the country house which Morris had selected as a hiding place.
When he had finished, Pendleton sat frowning blackly. "Secret signals," said he. "He fears discovery so much that he has forbidden her approaching the house. A regular code has been arranged, eh? And the gloves were dropped in the road purposely. He slipped his answer into one of them. On her way back, she discovers her supposed loss, looks for the gloves, and finds them. It is quite ornate," with a bitter sneer. Then he took from the investigator's hand the card upon which he had copied the message of Allan Morris. "Tobin Rangnow," he said. Then, looking up, he inquired with a wan smile. "More secret writing, eh? Or is it a man's name?" "There is a decided Irish flavor to Tobin," answered Ashton Kirk. "But Rangnow is unfamiliar to me. And if it is a name at all, it is of Eastern European origin. In that case," laughing, "it could scarcely be expected to share the honors with Tobin." He took the card from Pendleton and looked at it thoughtfully. Then he glanced up in a satisfied sort of way. "As you suggested, Miss Vale no doubt returned, recovered her gloves, and read the message," said he. "As she had just warned him that his hiding place was discovered, it is only natural to suppose that his answer would have something to do with his future movements." "That seems likely enough," said Pendleton. "Look here, if we put a comma between the two words," went on the investigator, taking out a pencil and doing so, "the thing takes on the appearance of a name and address." Once more he gave the card to Pendleton. Then, rising, he went to the telephone stand and took up the directory. Skimming rapidly through this, he paused at a page and went down its columns carefully. Then, with a laugh, he slapped it shut. "We have it," declared he. "When we so desire, we can call at an apartment house known as the Rangnow and inquire for Mr. Tobin. And when we see that gentleman, we shall be looking upon one in the confidence of Allan Morris." There was a long pause on the part of Pendleton. Ashton Kirk rang for Stumph and directed him to turn the water into his bath and get him out some fresh linen. It was after the man had gone that Pendleton spoke. "When you came in, Kirk," he said, "you said something which conveyed the notion that you would not be much astonished if the police took up the Hume matter with Edyth Vale." "It is only the fact that the newspapers were first in discovering her apparent connection with it that has kept Osborne and his fellows from visiting her before this. Jealousy, you know, does many strange things." Pendleton did not reply. He bent his head and covered his face with his hands. Ashton Kirk went on. "The reasonable thing for her to do would be to come forward and tell the plain truth." Pendleton roused himself. "But don't you see that that is the very thing her brave nature will not do? She's protecting Morris. And she'll go on protecting him, no matter what the consequence to herself." "In that event," said the investigator, slowly, "we cannot be in too great a hurry in removing the cause that keeps Morris in hiding." "He'll have a task in that," said Pendleton. "As far as I can see, the man is up to his eyes in the crime, and that's why he is lying low." "I have warned you before now against jumping to conclusions," said the other, quietly. "Allan Morris may be a confederate of Locke's, or he may not. We have yet to establish the fact either way. And now Pardon me while I take a plunge and get into something presentable. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Mylan. Chapter 19. The Two Reports. After dinner, the two young men settled themselves in the library. Stumph served their coffee, and they renewed their acquaintance with the Greek tobacco. After a little time, there came a knock upon the door. "Come," called Ashton-Kirk. A short man, with remarkable breadth of shoulder and depth of chest, entered. He was smooth-shaven and salient of jaw, and wore the air of one who was not easily balked in anything that he undertook. "How are you, Burgess?" said the investigator. "Good evening," returned Burgess. He advanced and laid some neatly folded sheets at the elbow of his employer. "Fuller was busy, and I thought I'd bring these in myself. It's my report on Hume." "Ah, thank you." Ashton-Kirk took up the sheets and began running his eye through them. "As you get deeper into this record, did Hume keep his promise?" Burgess smiled. "As to possibilities, do you mean? Why, yes. Indeed, I rather think he exceeded them." The man lit the cigar which the investigator handed him and drew at it appreciatively. "I went it alone on the first day, but after that I took O'Neill and Purvis on. Between us, we managed to get at something pretty definite." "Has Fuller finished with Morris?" "He is typing his report at this moment. It will be ready in a half hour, I should think." "Please tell him to bring it in as soon as he has finished." Burgess nodded and went out. Ashton-Kirk continued to dip into the report here and there. "Among three of them," said Pendleton, "they should have sifted the man's life and adventures pretty well." As Ashton-Kirk continued to scan the pages, a peculiar expression slowly came into his eyes. "They seem to have done so, indeed. And rather cleverly, too, I think. Would you care to hear the report?" "By all means." Eagerly. The sheets were shifted into their proper order once more. Then Ashton-Kirk read: "A further investigation into the affairs of David Purtell Hume. No record was to be had of Hume beyond his settlement in the city in 1899. People in the same line of business were questioned closely, and those who knew anything of him at all clung to the idea that he was an American who had lived for many years abroad. So we had another look at the old passenger lists of the steamships, but this time we went further back. We knew that the simple ruse of a fictitious name would cover Hume completely, but it seemed the only thing to do, and we set at it systematically. In the records of the steamer Baltic of the Netherlands Steamship Company for the year 1897, we came upon the name of D. Purtell. Without much hope of learning anything definite after such a lapse of time, I inquired after this passenger. Luck was with us in the shape of an old clerk with a long memory. He faintly recalled something of the man, and after some talk got out still another book. And there it was. D. Purtell, so it seemed, had been involved in an attempt to smuggle a quantity of diamonds. Our next step was to visit the customs people. Their records were very complete. They even had a portrait of Purtell, which proved him to have been Hume beyond a doubt. Only a trifle of evidence had been secured against him, not enough to convict, and they were forced to release him.
This seems to have been Hume's specialty. However, through the customs service of other countries, they had learned quite a bit about him. The authorities of Holland, Spain and France knew him as one of the leading spirits in a system of smuggling that had been going on for years. Once Hume had been located in Antwerp, once at Hamburg, and for a long time at Bayonne. This system of contraband had been broken up just before he had been arrested by the United States Service. A number of the criminals had been convicted, but Hume, with his usual luck, had escaped once more, because of lack of evidence against him. Nothing could be learned of the movements of Hume between his arrest on the Baltic and his location here as a dealer in the curiosities of art. And after his going into business here, he kept to himself a great deal. But the drink habit caused him to frequent certain resorts, and it was at one of these that he first met Richard Morris, father to Allan Morris. "Ah," said Pendleton, "so Hume knew Morris's father." "I asked Fuller, in giving him his instructions, to have this fact established, if he could," said Ashton Kirk. "That both Hume and the elder Morris were heavy drinkers caused me to think it possible." "Is that all there is to the report?" "Almost." The investigator turned to the pages once more, and proceeded. Hume and the elder Morris became quite intimate and were often seen together. But what it was that formed the bond between them, no one knows, unless it be a deaf mute named Locke, who was frequently seen in their society and who seemed upon close terms with both. But within a year after their first meeting, Hume broke with Morris. This must have been serious, for it caused a marked enmity to spring up between them. A number of people recall that Richard Morris frequently made threats against the other, threats of personal violence and also of the law. But before anything could come of these, if he really meant them, he died. Thinking that Locke might be able to throw some light on this phase of the case, we have endeavored to locate him. Up to this time, we have met with no success, but we hope to learn something of him at an early date. Ashton Kirk laid the sheets down upon the table. "There follows a list of the names of the people who have supplied this information, and their addresses," said he. "Burgess is very thorough in his work." "Outside the fact that Hume was a scoundrel, which we knew before, and that he was acquainted with Locke and Allan Morris's father, what does this report tell you?" There was discontent in Pendleton's voice as he asked this question, and the investigator smiled as he made answer. "That Hume knew the elder Morris supplies us with a theory as to the possible part which the younger Morris has taken in this drama. Whatever passed between Hume and the father has probably been taken up by the son." "Why, yes," said Pendleton. "I hadn't thought of that." "Another thing," added Ashton Kirk. "The report has swung like the needle of a compass, and indicated a fact that my imagination suggested days ago." "And that is?" "That Hume once lived in the French town of Bayonne." Pendleton frowned impatiently. "I don't know whatever made you imagine that," he said. "But now that you find that it is so, of what service is it?" "We will speak of that later," answered Ashton Kirk. Pendleton was about to say something more, but just then Fuller knocked and entered. "The report on Allan Morris," said he. "Ah, thanks." The investigator took the compactly typed sheets, and then he continued. "Tell Burgess that he need not bother about the man Locke whom he mentions. Say that I have already located him." "Very well." And Fuller left the room. For a space there was no sound save that which came from the street, and the rustle of the pages as Ashton Kirk went through them.
"Well?" asked Pendleton, finally. "What now?"
"Morris," replied his friend, "does not develop like Hume. Fuller suspected that he'd prove colorless, and so it has turned out. However, I'll read what he says. It's headed, 'A Second Report on Allan Morris.' A very careful inquiry failed to uncover anything in connection with this young man's personal affairs that was not mentioned in my first report on the same subject. He has led a very even, uneventful life, attending strictly to business, and making every movement count in the direction of distinction as a marine engineer. However, there has been something in his manner for the last few years that has attracted the attention of those who knew him best or came in contact with him. This took the various forms of eagerness of manner, irritability, long fits of reveries, a feverish desire for work. At his place of business I learned that he has, for some time, had a deep interest in the reports of the Patent Office. His clerks say that he'd read these for hours at a time. One of them told me of how he, the clerk, once forgot to call Morris's attention to the report until the day after its arrival. Morris has always been very tolerant with his employees, but that day he burst out into a fury and threatened to discharge them all. Richard Morris, father to Allan, was a most erratic genius, as my first report indicated. His propeller, his smoke consumer, and his automatic brake were valuable commercial properties, but had all slipped from his control. Toward the end of his life, he engaged in the perfection of an invention, of which he talked a great deal, and of which he declared that he alone would reap the benefit. As Burgess will have already told you, Richard Morris knew Hume. The latter was a frequent visitor to a shop which the inventor maintained in the outskirts, as was the mute Locke. I have talked with an old mechanic who worked for Morris at the time. He told me that the inventor had made a stubborn fight against the drink habit, and seemed likely to conquer it up to the time that he became acquainted with Hume. After this, however, he became as much a slave to it as ever. The invention, or whatever it was, never got beyond the paper stage. For thereafter Richard Morris spent his days in sleep, and his nights at the once famous Coffin Club." Ashton Kirk arose eagerly. "There is more," said he, "but it is scarcely of interest." Placing the report upon the table, he added, "You have heard of the Coffin Club, Pen?"
"Of course. It met in an underground place somewhere, didn't it? And if I remember right, it was fitted up like the Café Amour in Paris."
"Something of the sort." The investigator went to a huge card system and pulled out a drawer labeled T.O. "But I recall it best by the steward, whose philosophy and Irish turns of speech were so frequently quoted by the newspapers during the heyday of the establishment. Can you recall his name?"
"I know whom you mean," answered Pendleton, "but the name has slipped me."
Ashton Kirk paused in the fingering of the cards. "It was Tobin," said he. "It came to me that it was, but I wanted to be sure." He pushed the drawer into place, looked at his friend inquiringly, and added, "Suppose we go around to the Rang now and see him." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 20. One of the Old Sort. Pendleton looked at his friend in bewilderment.
You don't mean to say that the philosopher of the Coffin Club and this Tobin of young Morris's are the same?" cried he.
"I only think they are," said Ashton Kirk quietly. "But we can make sure by paying a short visit to the apartment house."
"Now?"
"There is no time like the present." And so the end of a half hour found them stepping out of a cab at the extreme west end of the city. It was only a little after 9 o'clock, but the streets were almost deserted. The arc lamps clicked and hissed lonesomely. Rows of darkened windows and shadowy doorways ran away on both sides. "There is the place we want," said the investigator, pointing at an illuminated sign which hung out over the sidewalk some little distance away. When they reached the place, they found it was rather a large building of the modern type. Pushing open the swinging doors and making their way through a brilliantly lighted passage, they found themselves in an equally brilliant office. Here they saw a dozen or more men seated in tilted chairs. All wore their hats, and for the most part smoked cigars. Behind a polished counter on which rested a nickeled cash register and a huge book, stood a white-haired man with a smooth Irish face and a pair of gold eyeglasses hanging by a black cord. The air was heavy with disputation. Long-tailed words boomed sonorously. Red-faced and earnest, one of the occupants of the chairs assailed the man behind the counter. With soft, sweeping, eloquent gestures, the latter defended himself. "And what," demanded he, placing his hands upon the shining top of the counter and shoving his head forward inquiringly, "is all this that we do be hearing about your suffragette? Who is she? What is she? The newspapers are filled to the top with her, but sorra the sight of her did I ever see. If she has any existence outside of the comic supplement, gentlemen, I'd like to have you show me where. Did you ever hear a whisper of her till she began to send herself by registered mail and chain herself to lamp posts? Niver, though, one of ye. Is your wife a suffragette? She's not. Is your mother? No. Your sister? Again, it's no. Then who is it that composes the great army of female ballot seekers? Is it the cook? The chambermaid? The woman that does the plain sewing? I'll wager 'tis not. They have too much to do already. It's not looking for additional burdens they are. Then where does this advanced woman flourish and have her being?" Here one hand went up and descended with a slap. "In the mansions of the rich," he declaimed positively. "In the lap of luxury. Among the feminine descendants of successful gumshoe men." Here the man with the flushed face attempted to speak, but an eloquent sweep of both hands silenced him. "They have nothing to do," stated the orator, "but to invent ways of pleasing themselves. Monkey dinner parties, diamonds, automobiles and boxes on the grand tier have no more attraction. Private yachts and other women's husbands have grown passé. They want a new toy, and faith, nothing will please them but the destinies of the nation. Their reasoning is simple and direct. If a man who wields scrap iron at a blast furnace is competent to handle the—" At this point the speaker was interrupted by Ashton Kirk advancing to the counter. "Pardon me," said the investigator, "but can you tell me where I can find Mr. Tobin? Is he in?" A look of great dignity came upon the face of the other, and he drew himself up stiffly. "You are speaking to him, sir?" replied he. "I thought so," smiled Ashton Kirk. "My old friend Dan O'Connor has mentioned you so often that I felt sure that I recognized the manner." The dignity vanished from Mr. Tobin's face, and the stiffness of demeanor fell from him instantly. "Do you know Dan?" asked he, eagerly. "Ah, there is the lad for you. A credit to his country and to his name. Faith, he is the best judge of whiskey in the city, and has a heart as large and as mellow as a barrel of it." "If it would not be putting you about in any way, we'd like a few moments in private with you."
At once Mr. Tobin touched a button. A young man presented himself, and to him the conducting of the house was transferred for the time being. Then the two friends were led into a small sitting room, where chairs were placed for them, and Mr. Tobin seated himself opposite them with some expectation. "Since I became manager here," explained he, "I seldom hear of any of the old lads. You see, it's so far from the center of the city," regretfully. "They seldom get along this way, so they do." "Yes, I suppose they cling to their old haunts," said Ashton Kirk. "Dan sticks to his school of boxing these days pretty closely. I often drop in for a round or two with him. He's as clever as ever, but he's slowing up." Tobin shook his white head sadly. "Tut, tut, tut," said he. "And do ye tell me that? Faith, he's a young man yet, not much over 60. And what call have he to be taking on the ways and manners of age? Even as late as the last year of the Coffin Club, he was as swift as the light." "He frequently spoke of that club to me," observed the other. "A queer place, I understand." Tobin nodded. "Queer enough," he answered. "And the members were as queer in some ways. Nothing would do them but they must spend their time underground, sitting at tables shaped like coffins, and drinking their liquor out of mugs shaped like skulls. I was steward there a long time and got good pay, but I never approved of the notion. It always seemed like divilment to me, did that." "Some very well-known people frequented it, did they not?" "Many's the time I've seen the governor of the state himself sitting there with a mug in his fist. The liquor was of the best, d'ye see," with a pleased light in his eyes. "I know that, for it were meself that selected them. And a good sup of drink is a great attraction, so it is." "I don't think that can be successfully denied," admitted the investigator. "Some very brilliant men have proved it to their sorrow." "True for you," said Tobin. "Don't I know it? We had actors and writers and editors, the cream of their professions, and every one of them a devotee, so to speak, of Bacchus. Sure, the finer the intellect, the greater the sup of drink appeals to them, if it does at all. One of the greatest frequenters of the club was a man whose inventions," with a grandiloquent gesture, "revolutionized the industries of the world. And when he was mellow with it, boys, oh boys, but he could discourse. His name was Morris," added the speaker, "and he was the father of the young man whose name has been mixed up with this Hume affair, which is so occupying the public mind just now." "Indeed." There was a pause. Tobin's mobile face looked back upon the past. His eyes had an introspective light in them. "To think," said he, "how the natures of men differ. Some are like the gods of old, and others again are like well, like anything you choose to call them. And yet," with philosophic speculation, "these two widely diversified types are sometimes friends. To the surprise of everyone, they occasionally take up with one another. It's hard to say why, but it is so." "I've noticed it myself," said Ashton Kirk. Tobin nodded. "Never," said he, "did I see it so exemplified as in the case of Richard Morris and this felly who has just been killed. Never were two men more unlike. But sorra such an intimacy did I ever see afore as there was between them. Morris, when he had the drink in him, was a poet. His ideas soared to the starry skies. He flew about upon the wings of the wind. Faith, I believe he thought the sun was not beyond his reach. But Hume was a divil. God save us that I should say the like about any human creature, but he had the imp in him, for many's the time I see it grinning and looking out at his two eyes." "I've heard it said that he was an unpleasant sort of chap," agreed the other. "Unpleasant," said Tobin, "does not do credit to his capabilities, though 'tis a good word enough. There was never a man came into the Coffin Club during the 5 years that I were there that looked as though the place fitted him but Hume. The others were like bad little boys who wouldn't take a dare. But Hume was just right. To see him lift one of the stone skulls to his lips and grin over it at you would make your blood run cold. And bless us and save us, gentlemen, how he would jeer and snarl and laugh all at the one time. Many's the time I've listened to poor Morris rave and paint his pictures of what he was going to do in times to come, and on the other side of the coffin table Hume would urge him on, leering and grinning like Satan himself, and making all manner of game of him. Bedad, me gorge rose at it more than once, and it was all I could do to keep from taking him by the scruff of the neck and throwing him into the street."
"Almost every man has some spark of good in his nature, however faint," said Ashton Kirk. "And Hume may have had one too, though no one seems to have discovered it."
Tobin smiled and returned, "An Irishman always has a good deal of respect for the fighting strain, no matter if it be in a man, or a beast, or a bird. Old Nick himself must be a grand two-handed man, and as such we must give him credit. And 'twas the same way with this felly Hume. He had real fighting blood, so he had. And sorra the man ever undertook to impose on him the second time."
"And as a true Celt, you held this to be a credit mark," laughed Ashton Kirk.
"I did. And indeed he seemed to consider it so himself, though he was not one to care a snap what others thought of him. But often he'd boast of the stock he came from. Oh, fighters they were to the core, he said. Fighters who never knew when they were whipped, and who'd go on fighting while they had a leg to stand on, an eye to see, and an arm to strike a blow."
Tobin here paused and stroked his smooth-shaven chin reflectively.
"He claimed descent from someone who was rated a real man in his day," he continued. "'Twas an officer, I think, who fought with faith, yes," smiling in recollection, "at the side of sorra the one less than Washington himself."
Pendleton, listening with dwindling interest, saw Ashton Kirk's hand clench, and saw a gleam shoot into his eyes. Then he saw him bend towards Tobin, his elbows on his knees, his clenched hands beneath his chin. "Ah," said the investigator, and his voice was calmer than Pendleton remembered ever hearing it before. "He claimed a pedigree, did he? And from a Revolutionary officer. Such things are always interesting. It's a pity you can't remember the soldier's name." Tobin pondered. "I can't," confessed he at length. "But there is one thing that I remember hearing Hume tell about him. It seemed laughable at the time, and I suppose that's why it stuck to me. It seems that the supposed ancestor were a great felly for dress, and expected the like of all the men under him. And though he often had niver a crust of bread to put into their mouths, he always managed to have a pinch of white powder for them to dress their hair." Ashton Kirk laughed suddenly, and leaned back in his chair. The gleam died out of his eyes, and a twinkle of satisfaction replaced it. "That," said he, "sounds amusing enough to be true. Mr. Hume's ancestor was at least consistent. But," and his tone changed, "we must not keep you from your duties, Mr. Tobin, so we'll get to the matter in hand."
"If it is not hurrying you,"
agreed Tobin. "A while ago," spoke Ashton Kirk, "you mentioned young Allan Morris. And during your conversation you have led me to think that you were his father's friend."
"I were," said Tobin. "He were a decent man."
"Then perhaps your friendship extends to the son as well."
"Perhaps it does."
And a note of perceptible caution crept into Tobin's voice. "I am glad to hear it," said the investigator. "He seems badly in need of friends of the right sort just now. And I am confident, Mr. Tobin, that you are of that sort."
"A man who has disappeared as completely as this one has done," stated Tobin, "is out of the reach of even the best of friends."
"Have you not heard from him since the murder?"
"No," replied the other, with a readiness that carried conviction.
"Then you will, and before long." Ashton Kirk arose and stood looking into the old man's face. "Perhaps it will be tonight, but it will be by tomorrow night at latest. And when you do, you can best show your friendship for him by telling him not to be a fool."
"You mean," said Tobin, shrewdly, "that I'm to advise him to give over hiding?"
"Exactly."
"I'll do that willingly enough if I hear of him. An innocent man has no call to hide himself like a rat. But," inquiringly, "after I tell him that, what will I do?"
Ashton Kirk took out a card. Handing it to the other, he said, "Ask him to come see me." Tobin gave the card one glance, then his face lit up and his hand went out.
"Let me shake your hand, sir," said he, "and I'll tell the lad what you say with a heart and a half."
End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 21. Ashton Kirk begins to plan. As Ashton Kirk and Pendleton left the Rangnow, the latter said, "You surely do not suppose that Morris will call on you?" "Why not?" "It does not sound reasonable." "A day or two ago I would have said the same. But things are taking on a different aspect. And with their change, Morris will change. He had no idea of what was to come, or he would not have done what he has done." "No criminal would," said Pendleton. Ashton Kirk shrugged his shoulders at this, but made no direct reply. "And now, if these newspapers, with all their pointed references to Edyth Vale, do not make the man come forward," he went on, "what is about to happen, say within the next 48 hours, will be sure to do so." Pendleton turned a surprised look upon him. "You think then that something unusual is about to happen?" "I know there is," was the quiet reply. "Tonight, old chap, has been most prolific in results. It has indicated why the murder was done. It has suggested the identity of the actual murderer. It has even pointed out the spot upon which we shall finally take him." "You really mean all that?" cried Pendleton, incredulously. "I do." "Then you must have learned it at some time while I was not—" Here Pendleton paused, and then proceeded in another tone. "But you have not been out of my sight since dinner. Everything you have heard, I have heard. All that you have seen, I have seen." "Just so," said Ashton Kirk. There was a pause. They walked along toward the place where they were to get a street car. At length Pendleton spoke once more. "And from the rather bald reports of your two assistants and the talk of this man Tobin, you have gathered these most vital facts?" "We can hardly call them facts as yet," said the other. "But I have every confidence that we can do so within the time specified." A gong sounded sharply and a car crossed the street. Pendleton placed his hand upon his friend's shoulder. "Kirk," said he,
I am not going to ask another question. I'm just going to wait, and if it turns out as you say, I'll never question a statement of yours as long as I live. I'll swallow them all as the Mussulman swallows the Koran." They boarded the car, and Ashton Kirk settled himself in a corner. His arms were folded across his chest; his head gradually sank forward. To all appearances he was asleep, but Pendleton knew that he was merely turning over some plan of action that would, in a little time, begin to reveal itself. However, he was not prepared for such quick action as resulted. For suddenly Ashton Kirk jumped up, glanced out at the car window, then darted to the platform and leaped off. Pendleton followed at once, and came up with him part way down an intersecting street. "Where to now?" he asked. "City Hall," replied Ashton Kirk, briefly. It was no great distance to the municipal buildings. They shot up in the elevator and entered the police department. "I'd like to see Superintendent Weagle," said the investigator to the officer who came forward to speak to them. "He's just getting ready to go home," answered the man. "But I'll see what I can do." The superintendent of police happened to be in an obliging humor, and they were shown into his office a few moments later. Weagle stood in the middle of the floor, drawing on a light overcoat. The end of a black cigar was clenched between his teeth. "How are you?" greeted he. "Anything doing in my line?" "Not just yet," replied Ashton Kirk. "But I have some hopes." The official laughed. "We all have them," said he. "If we didn't, we might as well put up the shutters." He threw the cigar end away and wiped his stubby mustache with a large handkerchief. "You've come for something," said he. "What is it? My wife and kiddies are expecting me, and I must get home." "How long are you going to maintain the police guard at 478 Christie Place?" inquired the investigator. "I hadn't thought of it," replied the superintendent. "However, we are in the habit of keeping such details up for some little time. Another thing, there is a lot of valuable stuff there which must be looked after."
"Beginning with tomorrow night," said Ashton Kirk, "I want you to withdraw your men. And further, I want your permission for my friend Mr. Pendleton and myself to watch in their place." The official opened his eyes at this.
"Well," said he, after a moment's silence, "I don't just understand your reasons, and the thing is most unusual. But," and he nodded his head approvingly, "I've always noticed that you have reasons behind everything you do. And if this thing is expected to throw any further light on the Hume case, why, it shall be as you say."
"Thank you," said Ashton Kirk. "Unless I am much mistaken, it will close the matter finally as far as your department is concerned, and put the whole thing up to the district attorney."
"You mean," said the superintendent with interest, "that you've got something new on Spatola? And perhaps on Morris and the girl?"
"I mean," answered Ashton Kirk, "that I hope to place the murderers of the numismatist Hume in your hands in a few days, whoever they may be." Weagle waved his hand.
"That's all we want," said he with a laugh. "Give us the right ones and we'll make no complaint. And now, if you have nothing more to say, I'll say good night."
They parted with the superintendent in the corridor. Then Ashton Kirk led the way into a room where some police officials and a number of young men were lounging about.
"Oh, how are you?"
Greeted a stout sergeant affably.
"And how's the work?"
While the investigator was speaking to the sergeant, one of the alert-looking young men approached.
"Pardon," said he, "but is there anything you'd like to say to the Star?"
"No," replied Ashton Kirk.
You are working on the Hume case, are you not?" asked the reporter with professional insistence.
Oh, I have had a little interest in it as an outsider, that is all," returned the other. "However," as he was passing through with Pendleton, "I can give you a piece of official police news on the case which I just got from the superintendent. After tonight, the guard will be removed from Hume's place. Weagle thinks the regular policeman on the beat is all that is needed from now on."
As they left the building by the main door, Pendleton said:
"A little while ago I rashly promised to ask no more questions. If you'll release me from that, I'll unburden myself of one or two which will otherwise keep me awake tonight."
"Go ahead," said Ashton Kirk with a smile.
"Why," asked Pendleton, "do you want the police called off at Hume's? And why should we place ourselves on watch instead?"
"At the very first, we made up our minds that the men who murdered Hume were in search of something, didn't we? Up to this time, I have been unable to say whether they had succeeded or not. Now, however, I am convinced that they failed."
"Ah."
"Tomorrow the newspapers will announce that Hume's place is to be no longer guarded. It may be that the criminals are desperate enough to venture another visit in order to gain possession of the thing they covet. If they do, we shall be awaiting them."
"But how do you know that they failed of their object on the night of the murder?"
"You and I," said Ashton Kirk, laughingly, "are perhaps going to spend considerable time in Christie Place, beginning with tomorrow evening. And while there, we may find it dull enough, old boy. A little amusement of a practical sort might not be found out of place. So I'll not answer your question now. I'll allow it to stand until tomorrow night. And then I'll give it to you, compact and complete, with practical illustrations as I go along." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 22. Ashton Kirk is annoyed. On the following day, at about noon, Ashton Kirk's big French car glided up to the curb before the Vale House. A man with a thick neck and a small head nodded to the investigator. Another waved a hand from across the street. "Plainclothes men," he murmured, "and at watch upon the house. That means that this matter can be brought to an end none too soon for Miss Vale's comfort." He was getting out of his car when a brace of eager reporters accosted him.
"The Standard would like to have you say a few words for publication," said one.
The Herald will give you what space you require for a statement at any time you see fit to make use of it," declared the other.
"I'm very sorry," said Ashton Kirk, brushing a speck of dust from an immaculate sleeve, "but I have nothing to say that would interest your city editors, or the public. I have no doubt but that the police officials will be glad to acquaint you with anything new that has transpired, if there has been anything new." The newspaper men pulled wry faces.
"The police hang on to the Italian musician and profess to think he's the guilty party," said one. "If they have taken any steps beyond this before today, we have not known of it." "Why have the detectives been placed to watch Miss Vale's house?" asked the other. "And what has Osborne gone in to talk about?"
"Ah," said Ashton Kirk with interest. "Osborne is within, is he?"
"Yes. And why are you going in? What has been learned regarding Miss Vale's connection with the case that has not already been made public?"
"I would hardly undertake to answer that last," laughed Ashton Kirk. "So much has been made public in one way and another that I haven't been able to keep track of it all. My own visit is merely a friendly call. Why Mr. Osborne is here, I, of course, cannot say."
Leaving the newspaper men disappointed and dissatisfied, the investigator rang the bell and was admitted. In the hall, pulling on his gloves, was Osborne. "Hello!" exclaimed the latter. "So you thought you'd have a try too, eh?" The big man's tone showed that he was none too well pleased with his own visit. He jerked at his gloves viciously, and his brow was creased with vexation. And seeing that the other was disposed to do nothing more than nod, he went on. "Well, you'll have to have a lot better luck than I've had to have any at all. Miss Vale, it seems, is a young lady who knows very well how to say nothing. I've been here something like an hour, and have put her through a regular third degree. But I've had my labor for my pains, as the saying is. She has told me nothing except her opinion of the newspapers and the police."
"Miss Vale will see you, sir," said the manservant, returning. "And so you've given it up?" queried the investigator of Osborne. The big headquarters man shrugged his shoulders.
"Hardly," said he. "I've set a time on the thing. We scarcely like to go to extremes, as you perhaps know. But unless a clean breast of the matter is made, as far as the party knows," modifying his language because of the listening servant, "the same party will know what the inside of a cell is like by this time tomorrow."
"You really mean to make an arrest?"
"If we are forced to, yes."
Ashton-Kirk followed him to the door. "Extend the time limit," suggested he. "Make it the day after tomorrow, and," elevating his brows, "I don't think that you'll need to do anything unpleasant."
"Ah," said Osborne. "You're on to something."
He regarded the other questioningly for a moment, then broke into a grin.
"No use to ask what it is, I suppose?"
"I thought not."
"Well,"
reflectively, and in a lowered tone,
"it won't do any harm to oblige you, if the front office is willing. The party can't make a move that we won't know about. And the fact is, I've just advised that no going out of any kind be ventured on. So long. Good luck."
The door closed behind Osborne, and then Ashton-Kirk followed the soft-footed servant down the hall, up the stairs, and into the presence of Edyth Vale. The girl received him smilingly. "I'm getting to be a regular occurrence," said he, as he sat down. "But a welcome one, nevertheless," she returned. "Indeed, if it were not for certain other depressing circumstances, I'd find your visits dreadfully exciting." "I suppose Osborne is one of the circumstances referred to. I just met him in the hall, and he seemed to be quite in a state of mind. What have you been saying to him? Or rather," smiling, "what have you not been saying to him?" "He came on what he calls police business," smiled Miss Vale. "I considered it quite an alarming expression, and said so. But that made no impression on him, for he proceeded with a string of wonderfully conceived questions that must have covered my life from birth to the present time." "The police have about the same method for each case. A sort of bullying insistence that breaks down denial by sheer weight." "I have read of it frequently in complaining articles in both magazines and newspapers. I think I have even seen it very earnestly compared to the Inquisition." The smile was still upon the girl's lip, but as she continued, her voice shook a little. "However, I never thought to go through even a part of it myself." "What the police say may be embarrassing and mortifying," said Ashton-Kirk gravely, "but it is nothing at all compared with what they might do." Miss Vale drew in her breath in a little gasp of terror, but she made an effort to conceal it with a laugh. "I know what you mean," she said, lightly. "You think that they might go so far as to take me into custody as an accessory to the crime, or even as the actual criminal.
Mr. Osborne told me that such was their intention, if you do not explain clearly your connection with the case. I don't think that the department is all that anxious to draw you into the matter, but some of the newspapers, as you no doubt have noted, have grown very insistent. They say that a poor musician is jailed instantly, while the woman of fashion, who is, perhaps, equally guilty, is allowed to go free. Such ways of putting things have a great effect upon public opinion. The politicians who conduct the municipal departments know this, and always move to protect themselves, no matter in what direction the movement takes them.
Then, said Miss Vale, you really think they will do as Mr. Osborne said?
I have no doubt of it, if the matter is not cleared up before the time arrives for them to act. The girl arose and went to a window as though to look out. The investigator saw her hand pressed to her heart, and noted the trembling that had seized her. Yet, when she faced him once more, a moment or two later, she made a brave attempt to smile as before.
"I think this is too bad of you," she said. "Your point of view is almost as pessimistic as the detectives or the newspapers. I had expected comfort and encouragement."
"And I came to give it, if you'll allow me." She looked at him for a moment. Then both hands went out in a mock despairing gesture, and she laughed. But the laugh was unmistakably forced, and a keen ear for such things would have detected a pathetic little catch in it.
"Now," she said, "you are becoming mysterious. However, I suppose I must not complain, for it is entirely in character with your profession, isn't it?"
He disregarded both the observation and the tone. There was a slight pucker between his keen eyes that spoke of impatience and resentment. "Mr. Osborne has been very plain with you, Miss Vale," said he. "You have perhaps become accustomed to it in a measure. So I shall not hesitate to follow in his footsteps. I am going to make you face some very plain facts."
"Mercy!" she laughed. "Mercy, Mr. Ashton-Kirk. I had not thought that you could be so deliberately cruel."
"In the first place, Miss Vale," he began, paying not the slightest attention to her laughter or the mocking light in her eyes, "if you had continued as you began, this matter would have been cleared up before this. The newspapers would never have printed your name in connection with it, and you would have been spared the mortification of a detective at your doorstep."
"Is there one outside?"
"There are several. If you venture out, you will be followed wherever you go." The girl sank into a chair in a limp, rumpled sort of way. Somehow the idea of surveillance affected her more than anything else. Her face became ashen. Her hands shook distressfully as she clasped them tightly together. "When you allowed the fears and desires of Allan Morris to cloud your reason, you made a mistake. You admitted as much when you came to me after the murder. But instantly upon seeing him again, you were as before. He was struck with fear, and he communicated his terror to you. As before, you dreaded to trust anyone, even myself."
"I think you are inclined to take a great deal for granted," said Miss Vale.
But in spite of the words, her eyes were wide with alarm. "He told you of the deaf-mute Locke," said Ashton-Kirk, "and also other things, which seem to have induced you to visit Locke at the Institute near Cordova on the night before last." Miss Vale elevated her brows in surprise. Her attitude was one of wonderment.
"I don't think I understand."
and you did not seem to understand yesterday when I called upon you. You fancied that I was not sure that I had seen you, and had come expecting you to admit the visit to Locke. And as I went away, you also fancied that you had thrown me off the scent." He smiled at the recollection, in spite of his evident resentment of her position. "But the fact of the matter was that I knew your fiancé had been the cause of your visit to the Mute. You had seen Morris, you knew where he was, and I thought it would be a useful thing for me to be also acquainted with his whereabouts." "But," protested Miss Vale in a faint voice, but still acting her chosen role to the best of her gifts, "if I had known and desired to conceal his whereabouts, surely you did not expect me to tell you of it." "Not directly. But, if you remember, I dropped a hint that his hiding place was about to be discovered. This was true. You were about to disclose it. I had only to wait and follow as you rushed off to warn him." She leaned back in her chair and regarded him strangely. But he proceeded with evenness. "Your work upon the road was very clever. I congratulate you upon it. But it was scarcely sufficiently inspired to deceive an old hand." Here he waited, apparently expecting her to speak. But as she did not take advantage of the pause, he went on. "I called this morning to acquaint you with these things, and to advise you on your future course. I must admit that I rather admire your steadfastness in following out what Allan Morris has desired of you. However, it is a great mistake for a strong nature to submit to the clamorings of a weaker one." She sat suddenly erect. Protest was in her eyes, and one hand went up in denial. But though her lips opened as though she were about to speak, no words came. Once more she sank back in the chair with the air of one compelled to admit a bitter truth. "I am not so sure as to how deep Morris is in this murder," continued the investigator, "but I have some ideas on the subject. On the other hand, I am quite sure that you are promised to aid him, and that you feel duty bound to do so to the end according to his not very wise instructions." He arose and stood looking down at her kindly. "My advice to you," he went on, "and I speak with a fair knowledge of the facts, is that you do nothing more. Be content with what you have attempted. Allow me to act for you in anything further which you have in mind. Or, if you cannot give me your confidence, let me carry the thing on in my own way, as you proposed at the first." There was a pause of some length. Then the girl spoke. "I am just a trifle bewildered at all this," she said. "And I really cannot say, Mr. Ashton Kirk, that I altogether follow you." He smiled, but the disapproving wrinkle still showed between his eyes. "I see that you are still determined to hold on to your attitude," he said. "I am sorry, of course. But then one is called upon at times to do as one thinks best. And I suppose that is what you are doing." He turned toward the door, and she rose and touched the bell. "Good bye." "Good bye," she returned. He stood for a moment in the doorway, regarding her with mingled annoyance and admiration. As he caught the steps of the approaching servant in the hall, he said: "Possibly I can save you some little trouble. You need not call at the Rangnow Apartments. Up to last night, Allan Morris had not notified Mr. Tobin as to his new hiding place. However, if you feel that you must see him, you can call at my place at this hour on the day after tomorrow. I am not sure, of course, but it occurs to me that he will be there. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 23: The Secret of the Portrait. The morning papers had all announced the fact that the detail of police would that day be withdrawn from the scene of the murder in Christie Place. With them it had been a mere matter-of-fact news item. But with the evening sheets it was different. They had had time to digest the matter, and their view of the order was one of surprise. Two or three allowed this feeling to expand itself into headlines of some size. A few also commented on the situation editorially. Superintendent Weagle had been interviewed. He stated that he could not be expected to maintain a detail at 478 indefinitely. Even with the police withdrawn from within, so he maintained, the place would be as effectually guarded as were other buildings. What more was required? Ashton Kirk read all this with some satisfaction in the late afternoon. "They have given the thing even more publicity than I had hoped for," he said, as he helped Pendleton into the details of a rough-looking costume which that worthy was donning. "It must be a bad day for news, and they have plenty of space. At any rate, anyone who is at all interested in the fact is now aware that after 6 o'clock this evening, 478 Christie Place will be unguarded, except for the regular patrolmen. Of course," with a glance at Pendleton and another in a mirror at himself, "if a brace of rough-looking characters are hidden away within, there will be only a few who know it." He opened a drawer and took out two black, shining objects. The short barrels and blocky shapes told Pendleton that they were automatic revolvers. "They will throw 10 slugs as thick as your little finger, while you're winking your eyes many times," said Ashton Kirk. They each slipped one of the squat, formidable weapons into a hip pocket. Then they made their way out at the rear of the house. With the collars of their sack coats turned up and their long visored cloth caps pulled down, they hurried along among the dull-eyed throngs that bartered and quarreled and sought their own advantage. And when, in the uncertain dusk, a wagon drew up at 478, and two sack-coated, cloth-capped men began carrying parcels up the stairs, is it any wonder that Berg, watching from the window of his delicatessen store, said to his clerk: "That furrier that rents the rooms by the third floor is putting some more things in storage over the summer yet." And when the wagon finally drove away, neglectfully leaving the two men behind, it is not surprising that the fancy grocer did not notice it. And then, when the two policemen who had been on duty during the afternoon came out, carelessly left the door unlocked, looked up to make sure that they had left none of the windows open, and then strode away with a satisfied air that follows a duty well done, who so keenly watched as to suspect? The shadows on the second floor lengthened and grew grayer. They thickened in the corners. Pieces of furniture grew vague and monstrous as the darkness began to cling to them and their outlines became lost. Suits of armor loomed menacingly out of the gloom, the last rays of light striking palely upon helm or gorget. Hideous gods of wood and stone smiled evilly at the two watchers. "There was food in the bundles which we carried up, then?" commented Pendleton,
as he lay back on the old claw-footed sofa.
"Yes," answered his friend. "The person or persons whom we expect will hardly come tonight, though we, of course, don't know. If they fail to appear, we shall be forced to stick close to these rooms during the whole of tomorrow, and also tomorrow night. Perhaps it will even be longer."
"In that case," said Pendleton, a little disconsolately, "the eatables will be very welcome. But I hope we won't have to stay long enough to finish them."
"Perhaps," said Ashton-Kirk, "I've let you in for too hard a task in this, Pen?"
The other rose up instantly. "You couldn't give me too much to do in this matter," declared he, earnestly. "I would do it alone if you were not here, and I had brains enough, Kirk. The thing must end. If it goes on much longer and I keep seeing these infernal insinuations in the papers, I'll go completely off my chump." There was a little silence. Then Ashton-Kirk said: "I never knew that you were this way, old chap, until the other day. How long has it been going on?" "Why, for years, I think," answered Pendleton. "Being very distantly related, Edyth and I saw quite a deal of each other when she was a slip of a girl. And she was a stunner, Kirk, even then. Kid-like, I fancied I'd get it all over with when the proper time came. Somehow I never got around to it. She turned out to be a dickens of a strong character, you see. And she expected so much of life that I got the notion that perhaps I wasn't just the right sort of fellow to realize her ideals. You know, old boy, there are times when a man thinks quite a bit of himself. This is more especially so before he's 25. But then again, there are times when he sees his bad points only. And then, of all the unutterable dolts in the universe, he gets the notion that he is the worst. When we were at college and I held down that third base position and hit .320 in the first season, I was chesty enough. I suppose you remember it. And when I came into my money and began to make collections of motor cars, yachts, and such things, I thought I had taken life by the ears and was making it say uncle. Well, we're only grown-up boys, after all. I recall that I thought I'd dazzle Edyth with my magnificence, just as Tom Sawyer did the little girl with the 2 long braids of yellow hair. Do you remember? And it was after I discovered that she was not to be dazzled that I sort of gave up. I wasn't anybody. I never would be anybody. And Edyth would be the sort of woman who would expect her husband to take the front at a jump. And no sensible person could imagine me at the front of anything. Unless it was a procession on its way to the Bow Wows.
"I think," said Ashton-Kirk, "that you began to prostrate yourself before your idol. And when a man takes to that, he always gets to thinking meanly of himself. The attitude has much to do with the state of mind, I imagine. Miss Vale is a courageous, capable girl, but you can never tell what sort of a man a woman will select for a husband. Girls have fancies upon the subject, and give voice to them sometimes. But it is the man they choose, and not the one they picture to whom you must give your attention."
"I suppose that is true enough," said Pendleton.
"Miss Vale's evident strength awed you," went on the other, "and then your timidity began to magnify her qualities. No woman is what she seems to be to the man who loves her. Miss Vale is not so difficult to please as you thought. I fancy that her engagement to young Morris proves that."
There you have it.
cried Pendleton.
"That's it, Kirk. I've stood aside considering myself unworthy, and allowed a fellow to slip by me who is as colorless as water. Allan Morris is no more fit to be her husband than—"
At loss for a simile, he halted for a moment, and then burst out,
"Oh, he's impossible!"
"So far as we have tested him, certainly," agreed Ashton Kirk. "He has shown no great strength of character."
"He's acted like a frightened child all through this affair. He's mixed up in it, and through his weakness allowed Edyth to also entangle herself. Again and again he's run to her or called to her to tell her of some fresh complication that he'd gotten his frightened self into. And to protect him, she has dared and done what would have frightened an ordinary woman into fits."
"I think," observed Ashton Kirk, "that she has realized his position, to some extent at least. The fact that he is weak has, I think, dawned upon her already. She may also see his evident selfishness before long. If she does, why, might there not still be some hope for you, Pen?" Pendleton shook his head in the gloom.
"I'm afraid not," said he, hopelessly. "Somehow a weak man makes a great appeal to the woman who has grown to care for him. He arouses her mother instinct. And Edyth is so strong that her pity—"
"May induce her to do her utmost to see him through this trouble," interrupted Ashton Kirk. "But it may not carry her much further. When once the thing is over, a reaction may set in. Who knows?" But Pendleton refused to be comforted. For a long time they talked of Edyth Vale, Morris, and the killing of Hume. Finally Pendleton said,
"I suppose we can't smoke here tonight, can we?"
"No, the lights might be seen, and we can't tell what sharp eyes are watching the place." Pendleton sighed drearily. There were many clocks in the rooms. The policemen must have amused themselves by winding and setting them; for at the end of each hour they began to strike, singly and in pairs. The brisk strokes of the nervous little modern clock mingled with the solemn, sonorous beat of an old New England timepiece, whose wooden works creaked and labored complainingly. Elaborate Swiss chimes pealed from others. Through the darkness a persistent cuckoo could be heard throwing open a small shutter and stridently announcing his version of the time. It was some time after midnight that Pendleton began to yawn. Then Ashton Kirk said: "Open some of those blankets, Pen, and lie down. There is no need of two of us watching tonight. I scarcely expect anything to happen." Pendleton did not expect anything either, but he said:
"All right, I will. If you'll wake me in a few hours, and let me take a turn at it." Ashton Kirk agreed. Pendleton stretched himself upon the sofa, and soon his deep breathing told that he was asleep. As the night drew on, the solitary watcher grew chilled in the unheated rooms, and huddled himself into another blanket. But he sat near the door leading to the hall, which was slightly ajar; and though his eyes closed sometimes in weariness, he never lost a sound in the street or a tick of one of the clocks. Through the entire night he watched and waited, almost without moving. It was not until the dawn of a gray, dirty day began to somewhat lighten the room that he aroused Pendleton. The latter expostulated sleepily when he noted the time; but with scarcely a word the investigator took his place upon the sofa and dropped off to sleep. About 9 o'clock he awoke and found his friend arranging their breakfast upon a small table.
"I say, Kirk," said Pendleton, admiringly, "you did this thing rather thoroughly. There's quite a tasty little snack here, and the thermos bottles have kept the coffee steaming."
At the water tap in the rear, the investigator bathed his hands and face. Then he sat down with his friend and did complete justice to the breakfast. Afterwards, with their cigars going nicely and a feeling of comfort stealing over them in spite of the rather uncomfortable night, Pendleton said: "You promised the other night to tell me what made you think that the murderers had failed to secure the thing they sought. The words that the promise was couched in made me think that you had also something to show me. And as we could not light up last night, I've waited patiently until today. Now, you must ease my curiosity. Come, tell me a few things." Ashton-Kirk took the cigar from his mouth. "I told you," said he, "that the reports of Burgess and Fuller, together with the conversation we had with Tobin, had enlightened me upon these points." As he enumerated them, he checked them off with his fingers. "Why the murder was done, the identity of the confederate of Locke, that the man would return to the scene of the crime."
"Yes," said Pendleton. "Those, I think, were the points."
"The first two," went on the investigator, "I will allow to stand for a while. But I promised to illustrate for you, and I think I can do so." Ashton-Kirk here arose and passed through the storeroom and kitchen into the bedroom. "The writing upon the step in the hall," said he, facing his friend, "directed Locke's confederate to look for something behind Wayne's portrait. As all the pictures of Wayne in the place were broken or otherwise showed traces of rough handling, it seemed that the thing desired must have been found. However, I was not sure about that, as I have told you. If you will recall Tobin's remarks of the other night, you will note that the only thing he could admire in the man's character was his fighting spirit. Then it developed that Hume made a boast of having come by this naturally enough. He claimed descent from one of Washington's officers. Tobin could not recall the officer's name, but he related an anecdote of him that was unmistakable. The officer was General Wayne."
"By George!"
cried Pendleton. "The collection of Wayne portraits was in this way explained. It was also suggested to me that Hume might be an assumed name, that the numismatist might have once been known as Wayne, and that Locke had known him by that name. Of course, it's quite likely that he was not really a descendant of Wayne, but he probably called himself Wayne nevertheless."
"I see," said Pendleton, his hands waving with excitement. "And in the stress of the moment, Locke wrote the name Wayne upon the step in candle grease, forgetting that his confederate only knew their proposed victim as Hume."
His eyes rested upon the walls and upon the sneering, unpleasant portrait of the murdered man.
"He meant that the thing he desired was there," indicating the portrait with an exultant sweep of the arm. "And by George, it must be there still."
He sprang forward with the evident intention of wrenching the picture from the wall, but Ashton-Kirk restrained him. "Don't," said he. "We'll leave that for our expected visitor."
"Surely," protested the excited Pendleton, "you don't propose to leave the thing there? Think of the risk. You might lose it in the end. For, you know, one never foresees what is to turn up."
"A fisherman must always risk losing his lure," answered the investigator, composedly. They spent the long hours of the day in smoking and talking, and at intervals they ate the sandwiches and other things which had been smuggled in the guise of packages of furs. And finally the shadows gathered and thickened once again in Christie Place. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 24. The Second Night. The second night of the vigil in Hume's rooms wore on. Unlike the preceding one, the two young men were almost entirely silent. When they did speak, it was in tones so low as to be scarcely above a whisper. There was a taut, indefinable something in the air that kept the desire for sleep from both. In the brooding darkness they were alert, watchful, expectant. The tobacco-loving Pendleton afterwards recalled with surprise that not once did he think of the weed. But when the queer, mysterious night sounds began to come, those creaking of loose planks, strainings of unseen timbers, and untraceable snappings in the walls that are common in old houses, he frequently thought of the automatic revolver, and the chill of the polished metal always felt comforting enough. The clocks announced the ends of the hours according to their temperaments. Coming in the midst of the total silence, the din seemed to Pendleton to be terrific. He pictured appalled criminals on their way through the dark halls, crouching in fear at the sounds. 11 o'clock struck, and then 12 with its continued uproar. It seemed a long time before 1 and then 2 sounded. Pendleton's limbs were beginning to feel loggy and numb because of the chill and the continued inaction. He had ventured to stir them a little, and was wrapping the heavy blanket more closely about himself, when he felt Ashton Kirk's hand upon his shoulder. "Hush," said the investigator in a whisper. Instantly, Pendleton was motionless. He listened intently. The silence of the place seemed complete. "What is it?" he finally ventured to breathe. The hand upon his shoulder tightened warningly, but there came no other reply. Again Pendleton listened. The door of the showroom stood open. Ashton Kirk had placed it so in order that they might catch any sound that came from the hall. All the other doors leading into the hall from Hume's apartments were securely locked. Anyone who ventured into the suite must first pass through the showroom, where the two waited and watched. After a space, Pendleton's attention was rewarded. A faint, far-off rustling came to him. Somehow it gave him the impression of hesitation, non-assurance, timidity. He was speculating upon the queerness of this impression when there came a faint, momentary glow from the hall. Mysterious, phosphorescent, unreal. And then it vanished. Both young men were huddled upon the sofa, which was placed facing the open door. A huge Spanish screen was drawn before them, but the black leather was cracked in places, and through these they had a clear view of the hall. A moment later the glow appeared once more, but this time it was brighter. "Someone is on the stairs," reasoned Pendleton, his hand going to his revolver. "It looks as though he were lighting matches to show the way." Between the sputters of light were spaces of darkness. These were filled in by the faint, guarded rustling. But as the light upon each appearance grew brighter, so did the sound become more distinct. And at length a light resonance, unmistakably a footstep, came from the hall. Then, steadily, softly, the sound came on through the darkness. Nearer and nearer it drew, until at length it became unmistakable. The rustling was that of a woman's skirts. Then, so it seemed, the darkness of the doorway grew denser. The soft, quick breathing of the newcomer became audible. Her hands were heard moving over the door frame as she blindly searched for the door. Then, apparently, she learned that the door was open. A deeper breath showed the relief she felt at this. Now she carefully entered the room. Even before Pendleton's brain realized who it must be, he began to feel a tightening at his heart. And now, as he pictured her advancing with outstretched, groping hands into the darkened room, a room horrible with crime and secret dread, it was all that he could do to hold himself in check. He had almost an overmastering desire to spring up, to cry out to her, to tell her not to fear. He was still struggling with this feeling when he became aware that she had paused, and also that Ashton Kirk was once more gripping his shoulder with a warning hand. Becoming instantly alert, his senses perceived a stoppage of everything. The clocks seemed to tick more faintly. He could no longer hear the woman breathe. There was an instant that roared with silence. Then came the soft, steady padding of feet descending the stair. Then he heard the girl release her breath in a great, trembling exhalation. The rustle of skirts came quick and sharp in the darkness. He heard the door through which she had entered the room squeak upon its hinges, and then close with a click that proclaimed it fast. After this, there was a long pause. Pendleton could hear the faint breathing of the girl, and thought it rather odd that she did not catch the sound of his own. He pictured her leaning against the locked door, her heart throbbing with fear as she listened to the descending footsteps. Stronger and stronger grew his desire to leap up and assure her that friends were at hand. But at the same time, the warning grip of his companion, who seemed to feel what was in his mind, also grew stronger and stronger. With the closing of the door, the sounds from the stairs had ceased to reach them. There was a long pause. Pendleton, during this, grew sensible of a long, wavering mental antenna which he projected into the shadows. And its delicate sensitiveness told him of the silent approach of a fearful thing. A long, long time, it seemed to him, but in reality it was remarkably brief. Then the steps were heard, shuffling and secret, in the hall and very near at hand. A soft, uncertain touch fell upon the smooth glass of the door. Down its length the inquiring fingers traveled. Then the handle was tried, held a moment, and quietly released. The steps then receded lightly down the hall. For some moments all was quiet. Then there came the scratch of a match from the hall, and its accompanying flare, seen through the glass of the door. A little space more, and a rending sound came to their ears, followed by the falling of some metallic objects upon the floor. Pendleton required no explanation of these sounds. It was plain that the second intruder had come prepared, and had forced one of the doors. All the communicating doors of the suite had been left open. Through them came the pushing about of furniture and the drawing down of blinds. Then another match flared, followed by a stronger and steadier light, which showed that the second visitor had lighted the gas. The light filtered palely through the various rooms into the one in which the two men and the woman were hidden. By means of this, the former could make out the latter in a dim, uncertain sort of way. She seemed unusually tall as she moved noiselessly across the floor and peered cautiously through the communicating doorways. What she saw must have startled her, for she drew quickly back, her hand pressed to her heart. Then, softly, she retraced her steps. They heard the door catch slip quietly back, and were conscious that the door was swung open. The woman then crept, inch by inch, so it seemed, down the hall. It was the bedroom door that had been forced. The two watchers noted the bar of light that slanted from it across the passage. Nearer and nearer the woman approached to it. Pendleton had at first thought that she was making for the stairs, but this died away as she passed them unheeding. The automatic revolver was in his hand instantly. Leaning toward his friend, he breathed in his ear. "She's going in there." The blanket slipped from him as he arose to his feet. His legs were still cramped and stiffened. He felt clumsy and unsure. Ashton Kirk evidently agreed that the time had come for action, for he whispered in reply, "Through the rooms. I will take the hall." Pendleton stepped from behind the screen like a shadow. Through the door leading to the storeroom he had an uninterrupted view of a part of the bedroom. And across the floor he saw thrown the shadow of a man. Noiselessly he tiptoed into the kitchen, the revolver held ready. Just outside the bedroom he paused, and drawing to one side, waited. Then he noted the shadow move slightly, and heard a deep, rumbling voice say in French, "You are a devil. Even now, as I look at you, you laugh and jibe." The shadow upon the floor here swung its arms threateningly. "But laugh away. I have won, and it is my turn to laugh." Here the shadow slid along and up the wall. Peering around the edge of the door, Pendleton saw a man with massive, stooped shoulders and a great square head, covered with thick iron gray hair. And instantly he recognized him as the man whom they had seen that night in the doorway of Locke's workshop. The stranger was standing just under the portrait of Hume. He gazed up at it, and his big shoulders shook with laughter. "What a mistake to make," he said, still in French. "How was I to know that the old devil once called himself Wayne?" He reached up and took the picture from its hook. With thick, powerful fingers he tore the backing away, and a flat, compact bundle of papers was disclosed. The picture was thrown upon the bed, and the man stood staring at the papers, a wide smile upon his face. "So this is the secret, eh? Well, Locke will pay well for it, and it will be worth all the risks I've taken." He was fumbling with a coat pocket as though to stow them away, when there came a swift, light rush. The packet was torn from his hands, and Edyth Vale was darting toward the hall door and the stairway beyond. But despite his bulk, the man with the stooped shoulders proved himself singularly swift. In 2 leaps he had overtaken her. Dragging her back to the center of the room, he snatched the packet from her in turn. Regarding her with calm, pitiless eyes, he said in English: "I am sorry, miss, that you have come, eh? It makes it much harder for me. And I am of the kind that would rather be off quietly, is it not? And say no words to no one." Edith Vale, pale of face, but with steady eye, returned his look.
"What are you going to do?"
she asked.
"I am sorry to do anything," spoke the stranger. "I do not know you, and you will understand, will you not, that I can't leave you behind to talk."
As he spoke, a flashing something appeared from the girl's pocket. He lifted one huge paw to beat her down, but a clenched hand, protected by a corded buckskin glove, thudded against his jaw. His knees weakened, and he sprawled upon the floor.
"Jimmie!"
gasped Edith Vale.
"Jimmie Pendleton! Oh, Edith, Edith!"
was all the man could say. He slipped his arm around her, for she was tottering, and as he helped her to a chair, Ashton Kirk quietly entered at the hall door. "Miss Vale," said he, "good evening." Without waiting to note if she even gave him a look, he bent over the fallen man and snapped a pair of handcuffs upon his wrists. "A very pretty blow, Pen," said he, admiringly. "Beautifully timed, and your judgment of distance was excellent." He slipped the fallen papers into his pocket and continued: "Keep an eye on him for a moment." Then he stepped swiftly through the hall. A moment later they heard him throw up one of the windows overlooking the street, and a whistle shrilled through the night. "Paulson is on duty," said the investigator, returning. "He'll be here in a jiffy." Sure enough, they soon heard heavy steps upon the stairs, and then Paulson and a fellow patrolman appeared in the doorway. Astonished, the policemen gazed at Ashton-Kirk, who nodded to them smilingly. Then they turned their gaze upon Pendleton, who was speaking soothing words to the white-faced girl, who, now that the danger was over, clung to him tremblingly. But when their eyes centered upon the manacled stranger who was then dazedly struggling to a sitting position, Paulson asked: "Who is this?" "This," answered Ashton-Kirk, "is Monsieur Sagon, a fellow lodger of Antonio Spatola, formerly a very close friend of the late Mr. Hume, and once a resident of Bayonne, in France." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Ashton-Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Mylan. Chapter 25 Approaching the Finish. Pendleton spent the night at Ashton-Kirk's, and after breakfast he wandered into the library, a newspaper in his hand and an inquiring look on his face. The investigator was seated in his usual big chair, buried to the knees in newspapers, and making vigorous inroads upon the Greek tobacco. Fuller was just leaving the room as Pendleton entered, and nodding toward the disappearing form, Ashton-Kirk said: "There is some rather interesting news. I have had Locke, as you perhaps know, under observation for some time. Last night he took the train at Cordova, and Burgess followed him. When he reached the city he went directly to Christie Place, and was seen lurking about in the shadows." "Humph," said Pendleton. "What time was this?" "Perhaps about 11 o'clock. Burgess, so Fuller tells me, never lost sight of him. He acted in a queerly hesitating sort of way. Finally, however, he seemed to form a resolution, and went to the door of the Marx house." He was about to pull the bell, then paused and tried the door instead. It was evidently not locked. He seemed both surprised and pleased at this. He lost no time, however, but went in at once. Pendleton sat down.
"What do you suppose all this meant?" he asked.
"Well, we can't be too sure," replied Ashton Kirk. "But I think it probable that he also saw the news of the withdrawal of the police in the papers. Perhaps he came to Christie Place with the intention of informing Sagon of the opportunity that then presented itself. Or it might be that he had hopes of somehow overreaching his companion in crime."
"His lurking about would seem to point rather in that direction," said Pendleton.
"And his preferring to enter the lodging house without ringing also indicates some such idea. As I see it, he hoped to gain the roof unobserved. He knew the house and the habits of the people quite well. No doubt he had a plan, and a good one. He's a thinker, is Mr. Locke."
"If he was noticed, he could indicate that he had called to see Monsieur Sagon."
"Exactly. But I very much doubt his gaining the roof. Perhaps, after all, he was detected, for a few minutes later Burgess saw him leave the house."
"Humph!" said Pendleton. Then, after some few moments spent in the examination of his paper, he threw it down. "It's full of all sorts of allusions to monoplanes and such like," grumbled he. "As I had to take Edyth home last night, and you went bravely away with the police and Sagon, I find myself, as usual, trailing some distance in the rear."
Ashton Kirk regarded the litter of newspapers ruefully. "I gave them the heads of the case very plainly," said he. "But as it was almost the hour for going to press, I suppose they did not get the finer points of my meaning. Some of them have made a sad mess of it. However, the evening papers will have a coherent account, I suppose."
"If you think I am going to wait until the evening papers are issued to get to the bottom of this thing, you're much mistaken," declared Pendleton. "I demand a full and detailed explanation immediately."
Here a tap came upon the door. Stumph entered and handed Ashton Kirk a card. "Let him come up," said the latter. And as the man went out, he continued to Pendleton. "We will both probably be much enlightened now. It is Allan Morris."
"Just as you said," spoke Pendleton. "It's really almost like second sight."
The investigator laughed. "A small feat of reasoning, nothing more," said he. "However, an enthusiast might find some of the elements of second sight in our conversation in this room about a week ago." Pendleton looked at him questioningly. "It was on the morning that you came to announce the coming of Miss Vale. We were speaking of how it sometimes happened that very innocent things led to most weighty results. And I remarked, if you will remember, that your visit might lead to my connection with a murder that would dwarf some of these which we had spoken of."
"So you did," agreed Pendleton. "That is rather remarkable, Kirk."
"And further," smiled the investigator, "I recall that I expressed great admiration for Marryat's conception of a homicide, the matter of Smallbones and the Hag. The weapon used by Smallbones, it turns out, was identical in character to the one used by Sagon."
"A bayonet!" cried Pendleton. "By George, so it was."
Just then Stumph announced Allan Morris. The latter was pale and haggard. His clothes were neglected, and there were some days' beard upon his chin. He seemed astonished at sight of Pendleton. However, he only nodded. Then he said inquiringly to the investigator: "You are Mr. Ashton Kirk?" "I am. Will you sit down, Mr. Morris?" Morris sat down dejectedly. "Tobin advised me to come see you," he said. I refused at first, but in view of what the newspapers contained this morning, I reconsidered it." Ashton-Kirk nodded. "If you had come to me in the first place," said he, "you'd probably not have fallen into this mess, and you'd have saved yourself a great deal of suffering." He regarded the young man for a moment, and then went on. "Miss Vale, I suppose, has told you of her dealings with me?"
"She has," said Morris. "She's been very candid with me in everything." "If I had been the same with her," bitterly, "I should have acted more like a natural human being. You see, we were to be married. She was very rich, while I had comparatively nothing. But this in itself would not have been sufficient to have prevented our wedding for so long. The fact was that I had gotten myself into trouble through speculation. I had a fear that my position might even be considered criminal from some points of view. And I allowed myself to get nervous over it. However, there was a way by which it was possible for me to extricate myself. To explain this, I'll have to go back some years."
"Take your own time," said Ashton-Kirk.
"Well, my father had worked for years perfecting the plans of a heavier than air flying machine," Morris resumed. "At the time of his death he told me that it was all complete but the constructing, and that I had millions within my reach. But Hume had the plans. My father had borrowed money of him, a considerable sum, and had given him the plans as security. Hume had always derided the idea of the monoplane. Tobin, who knew them both, tells me that he was forever mocking my father upon the subject. And when the time came when the plans could be redeemed, Hume denied having them. There was no receipt, nothing to show that the transaction had ever occurred. The man declared that the whole thing was a drunken dream. He had never seen any plans, he had never paid out any money, he knew nothing about the matter. Time and again the man reiterated this. And each time, so I've heard, he would go off into gales of laughter. I have no doubt but that the entire performance on his part was to afford himself these opportunities. He seemed to love such things."
"Was it not possible for your father to duplicate the plans?"
"At an earlier time it would have meant but a few weeks' application at most. But at this period the thing was impossible. The last long debauch seemed to have sapped his intellect. It was also the direct cause of his death."
"I see," said Ashton-Kirk.
"I took the matter up with Hume at once," went on the young man. "But I had no more success than my father. In the man's eyes I had but replaced my father. I was another patient subject for his mockery, derision and abuse. There were some scattered drawings of the monoplane in father's office. I began a study of these, thinking to chance upon the principal idea. But I was unsuccessful. All this, you understand, was before I had met Miss Vale, and before I was tangled up in the trouble I have just mentioned. The fear began to grow on me that Hume meant to use the plans to his own advantage. I knew that he had long been familiar with Locke, who was reputed to be a mechanical genius, and between them I fancied they'd take action. I began a watch upon the reports of the patent office, thinking that that would finally give me something tangible to use against them. However, I never gave up my visits to Hume, or my efforts to make him admit possession of my father's property. It was during one of these visits that I first met Spatola, and I was much struck by the performance of his cockatoos.
My father had always held to the idea that the problem of flight would be finally solved by a study of the birds. This gave me an idea, and I took to visiting Spatola in his lodgings at Christie Place. He'd have the cockatoos fly slowly round and round the big attic, and I'd watch them and take notes. It was about this time that I met Miss Vale and asked her to be my wife. A very little later, in an effort to raise money, I got into the financial trouble which I have referred to. After a little, the question of a time for our marriage came up. I was filled with fear and put it off. This occurred several times, and I was at my wits' end. I could not marry with that thing hanging over me. Suppose it should turn out as I feared. Imagine the shock to a high-spirited girl to discover that she had married a defaulter. It was then that I turned to the matter of the plans as my only hope. With a perfected idea, I could readily secure a large sum of money in advance. So I redoubled my efforts to have a settlement with Hume. But he only derided me as usual. Continued visits to Spatola to study the flight of the birds showed me that the Italian was a fine fellow, well educated and with much feeling and appreciation. We became fast friends, and so, little by little, I told him my story.
About the invention? Asked Ashton-Kirk.
Yes.
The investigator turned to Pendleton. "I think," said he, "that I now understand why Spatola grew so uncommunicative and suspicious toward the end of our interview at City Hall. We both thought that it was because I spoke of shorthand, but it was perhaps because I mentioned an invention in the way of writing music. He feared that I was trying to incriminate Mr. Morris in some way." Pendleton nodded. "That," said he, "I think explains it." "As you no doubt know," went on Morris, after the investigator had once more given him his attention, "Spatola liked Hume none too well. And he had reason for his hatred, poor fellow. Well, he became interested in what I told him, and when he learned that I believed my father's papers were in all probability somewhere in Hume's apartments, he suggested that I come to live in Christie Place under an assumed name. He thought that in time an opportunity would present itself to cross the roofs some night, enter Hume's place by the scuttle, and so possess myself of the plans. On the day preceding the murder, I had made up my mind to have one more try with Hume, and if that failed, I intended to follow Spatola's advice, break in, and take the plans by force. I was so full of this resolution that I could not contain myself. I hinted at it to Miss Vale, and the result of that hint you know." He leaned his face forward in his hands and seemed to give way to a bitter train of thought. He was evidently despondent. "It was also some such hint upon your part that induced her to visit Locke at Dr. Mercer's place, wasn't it?" Morris raised his head and nodded. "Yes," he said. "After the murder, I suspected Locke at once of having something to do with it. I told Miss Vale. She went there without my knowledge. Seeing that I had not the courage to go myself," he added bitterly, "and demanded the plans." "And she learned that they were still at Hume's, behind the portrait." "Yes, Locke told her. He was overcome with horror at the murder. He had merely desired to secure the plans. Having somehow learned their hiding place, he had no intention of killing Hume." "But why did Sagon do it? He must have had it in mind when he bought the bayonet at Bernstine's," said Pendleton, looking at Ashton-Kirk. "He had. Do you recall how Burgess's report spoke of a league of smugglers in Europe, of which Hume was a leading spirit? And also of how they had been captured and nearly all but Hume were tried and convicted.
Yes.
Sagon was one of those convicted. The diamonds which Hume tried to smuggle into this country were to have been turned into money at the time of the gang's arrest, and the proceeds spent in their defense. But instead of doing this, Hume left his comrades to their fate and absconded. When Sagon gained his freedom, he began a search for Hume, meaning to have revenge. This search finally led him to Locke as a person who had known Hume, and who would be likely to be able to tell where he could be found.
Sagon has told you this?
Queried Pendleton. Yes, he talked freely after he saw that his case was hopeless. And he too insisted that Locke did not intend to commit murder. Locke, even at the time of his meeting Sagon, was looking for someone to aid him in gaining possession of the Morris plans. The workshop which we saw beside Locke's house contained a monoplane in course of construction. But there was something lacking which he felt Morris's plans could supply. And so he was anxious to get hold of it, by hook or crook. Sagon, whose purpose from the first was murder, was not at all adverse to combining it with something else. He took the room at Mrs. Marx's place, after he had perceived that an entrance could probably be made at Hume's by way of the scuttle. The well-dressed business guys that the machinist on the first floor spoke about to us were no doubt Locke, who frequently called upon Sagon, and Mr. Morris here, whom the man did not suspect of being a lodger. To prove a theory that I had formed, and which I have mentioned in a vague sort of way, went on Ashton Kirk, I asked Sagon why he had used a bayonet. And it turned out as I thought. Sagon and Hume had first met at Bayonne. The greater part of their operations had been carried on there. The band had been finally rounded up and convicted there. The bayonet, so legend has it, was first made in Bayonne. And Sagon conceived that it would be a sort of poetic justice if the traitor were to die by a weapon so closely connected with the scene of his treachery. There was a pause after this, and then young Morris got up, slowly and painfully.
I don't want it to be thought, said he, that I was directly responsible for Miss Vale's adventure of last night. Or any of the others, for the matter of that. If I had known at the time that she proposed visiting Locke's or Hume's either upon the night of the murder or last night, I would have prevented it.
Ashton Kirk nodded kindly. The young man's position evidently appealed to him. But Pendleton sat rather stiffly in his chair, and his expression never changed.
I will now come into possession of whatever value there is in my father's invention, went on Morris. And added to that, it turns out that the other thing, of which I stood so much in fear, has turned out favorably. In a disheartened sort of way. I don't care much, now that my engagement with Miss Vale is broken.
Broken? Exclaimed Pendleton.
I saw her this morning, said Morris. During the past week, he continued, it gradually came to me that I was not the sort of man to make her a fitting husband. I hid like a squirrel while she faced the dangers that should have been mine. I knew that she realized the situation as well as I, and I did what I could by making it easy for her. He paused at the door. If there is anything that I can do or say in the final settlement of this case, he added to Ashton Kirk, I will gladly place myself at your services, sir. Goodbye.
End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Ashton Kirk, Investigator. by John Thomas McIntyre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pete Milan. Chapter 26. The Finish. "For the first time," said Pendleton, as the door closed upon Allan Morris, "I can feel sorry for him. To lose a girl like Edyth Vale is indeed a calamity. Think of the courage she's shown, of what she was willing to do. Why, Kirk, she's 1 in 10,000." But Ashton-Kirk only nodded. He had arisen upon the departure of Morris, and was now drawing on a pair of gloves. The splendid qualities of Miss Vale apparently had little appeal for him at that moment. "Are you ready?" he asked in a businesslike way. "Ready?" repeated Pendleton, surprised. "To be sure. We can scarcely call this case complete until something has been done in the matter of Locke." "That's so. But somehow I had the notion that your men had already attended to him." "I always prefer to finish my work in my own way," said the investigator. "Osborne, as soon as he heard of Locke, through Sagon, wanted to take up the trail. But I convinced him that he'd better leave it to me." Pendleton clapped on his hat. "I'm with you," said he. "But where do you expect to find him?" Ashton-Kirk rang for Stumph and ordered the car. Then he replied, "We'll more than likely find him at home. Burgess followed him back to Cordova last night." They went down and climbed into the car, and were soon on the road. A little distance from the Mercer Institute, they came upon a compact-looking man seated upon the top rail of a fence, chewing at a straw. He wore heavy, much-splashed boots and a sun-scorched suit of clothes. "Ah," said Ashton-Kirk, "I see Burgess is still on the job." "Burgess?" echoed Pendleton. He looked at the man upon the fence in surprise. Except for the very broad shoulders, there was no resemblance. However, Burgess grinned amiably through a rather neglected growth of beard. "I expected you along about this time," said he to the investigator. "Is everything all right?" asked Ashton-Kirk. "He's still there," answered Burgess, and he nodded toward a house with a peaked and slated roof, which stood some little distance up an intersecting road. It was the same house through the window of which Pendleton had seen Edyth Vale some nights previously. But somehow it seemed strange and unfamiliar in daylight. "I can see 3 sides of it from here," went on Burgess. "And if he dropped out of one of the windows on the 4th side, I could sight him before he'd gone 50 yards. You may be sure he's there, all right." "You've heard of what took place last night, I suppose?" Burgess tapped a folded newspaper at his breast pocket. "So has Locke," said he. "Apparently his orders are to furnish him with the papers as soon as they arrive. A man from the Institute building brought one to him more than an hour ago." Just then Ashton-Kirk noted far up the road upon which Locke's house stood a very small buggy, drawn by an equally small horse. In the buggy sat a man whose huge bulk seemed to bulge out beyond its sides. Arriving before Locke's house, the small horse stopped, as though from habit. Then, with a mighty effort, the fat man rolled out and waddled to the gate. He pressed and repressed the button, but no one answered. Ashton-Kirk looked at his assistant. "Are you quite sure that our man is there?" asked he. Burgess chewed his straw calmly. "I'm positive of it," said he.
The fat man now entered at the gate, and going to the front door, tried it. But it was evidently fast, and he turned away. Hesitating for a moment, he laboriously approached the workshop, the roof of which could be seen through the trees. Apparently the result was the same here, for in a very few minutes he was seen to waddle back to his buggy and climb in with much effort. Then the small horse ambled forward, while the fat man leaned back in great distress.
"You recognize him, do you not?" smiled Ashton Kirk.
"I do now," returned Pendleton. "It's our friend Dr. Mercer." When the buggy arrived at the spot where the motor car stood, the doctor regarded its occupants with some surprise.
"Good morning," greeted Ashton Kirk.
Painfully, gaspingly, the other answered this in kind. The round white face wore an expression of martyrdom.
"I am pleased to see you once more," said he.
"You like driving in the morning, then?" said the investigator. The principal's flesh quivered with repulsion.
"It is an exercise ordered by my physician," he answered. "I protested against it strongly, but he was obdurate. And I am compelled to do it before I have had my breakfast."
Hollowly.
"It is scarcely short of barbarous."
Here the small horse stretched its neck and shook itself until the harness rattled. Pendleton, looking from master to beast, thought they might exchange places much to the master's ultimate well-being. There was a short pause, then Dr. Mercer bent his head toward them.
"When you visited the institute a few nights ago," said he, "you also, at my request, visited Professor Locke."
Ashton Kirk nodded.
"For some time," proceeded the other, "I have fancied that there was something wrong with him. Not of a physical nature, as is, unfortunately, the case with myself, but more in a mental way. But since that night I have been sure that some sort of a derangement has fixed itself upon him, or is in progress. He can scarcely be called the same person. More than once I have been afraid," and here the speaker lowered his voice to a husky whisper, "that he is unbalanced."
"That is very grave," said Ashton Kirk.
"It has occurred to me,"
went on the doctor, not without shrewdness,
"that something happened that night which unsettled him."
The eyes seemingly floating in fat turned themselves first to Pendleton, then to Ashton Kirk.
"I suppose, though, you know nothing of it."
"We noticed that he seemed greatly agitated," replied the investigator, "and we are alarmed to hear that he seems disturbed."
"It is our rule that no one leave the institute grounds after nightfall,"
said Dr. Mercer in a troubled voice.
"Last night I had occasion to send for him, but he was gone. This morning I stopped to reproach him for his absence, but apparently he has not returned." "You're mistaken there," put in Burgess. "Look." He indicated the house as he spoke. The small figure of Locke was seen emerging at the front door. He paused for a moment, peering this way and that in his nearsighted fashion, then hastily made his way toward the workshop. Evidently he had not seen them. With great labor and much catching of breath, Dr. Mercer had turned sufficiently to see these things. He seemed greatly astonished. "He was there all the time," said he. "It is not possible that he did not feel the vibrations of the buzzer, for he is very sensitive to such things."
His indignation appeared to swell him to even greater proportions than before.
"It is an affront!"
he stated in a choked tone.
"It is a deliberate affront. He felt the buzzer, and he knew it was I. But he did not consider me of enough importance to trouble himself about."
Panting, he sought to turn the small horse, but in a moment Ashton Kirk was out in the road and had the animal by the head. "I beg your pardon," said the investigator, "but it would probably be more beneficial to yourself and others if you continued your drive and left Professor Locke to us." Amazed beyond ability to stir, the doctor sat and stared. But finally he found his tongue.
"Bless my soul and body,"
exclaimed he with a great wheezing exhalation.
"I scarcely understand this, sir."
"My dear doctor," said Ashton Kirk soothingly, "it is not at all necessary that you do so. The fact is, to state it briefly, there is a trifling matter for adjustment between Professor Locke and the Commonwealth."
"The Commonwealth!"
cried the doctor, and he shook like a great mass of gelatin. "Nothing less. So you see it will be as well for you to do as I suggest." Then, turning to Pendleton, Ashton Kirk continued, "I think we had better walk the remainder of the way. Otherwise we might get Locke's attention before it is advisable." Pendleton jumped down, and without another word to Dr. Mercer, they set off toward the slate-roofed house by the roadside. However, after they had gone about 50 yards, Pendleton turned and looked back. He saw the small horse jogging away, while behind it, helplessly fat and hopelessly befogged, sat Dr. Mercer, swaying dispiritedly from side to side. As Ashton Kirk and Pendleton advanced upon the house, they bore in mind the possibility of Locke being on the watch. So they kept out of sight as much as possible. "It's rather odd, I think, that he hangs on here, knowing that his part in the murder of Hume must now be known," said Pendleton. "I rather expected an attempt at escape." "That may come later," said the investigator, grimly. "The finish of a thing of this sort is always a matter for speculation. I have seen desperate criminals who surrendered like lambs, and I've seen the other sort give a platoon of police a good day's work in their taking." "Do you think it possible that Locke is one of this latter type?" "There is no knowing. But I am inclined to believe that he is." Pendleton shook his head. It seemed impossible that this dapper little man, with his peering, short-sighted eyes, could be capable of any determined effort to escape the police when once driven into a corner. However, Pendleton had ample reason to respect Ashton-Kirk's judgment, and so, when the latter deemed it necessary to approach with caution, he acted accordingly. They paused in front of the house. It was now past 10 o'clock, and the sun was shining brightly. A little patch of garden, filled with early flowering plants, lay between the house and the wood. All about the workshop were the tall trees which they had noticed upon their previous visit. "We had better not use the gate," suggested the investigator. "There might be an attachment of some sort that will give him warning." So under cover of the trees they scaled the fence. Then they carefully made their way toward the shop. The windows and doors of this were closed. Nothing was stirring. Near the door was scattered some rubbish and loose paper. The place had an utterly deserted look. "Do you think he is here?" asked Pendleton. "I will know in a few moments," replied the other. "Wait here." Pendleton expected Ashton-Kirk to continue his cautious approach; but to his surprise, the investigator, with cool assurance, stepped out from behind a tree and advanced toward the outbuilding.
When he reached the door, he opened it and calmly stepped inside. The building was in one great room. It had some windows at the side, but the greater part of its illumination came from a huge skylight. As he closed the door behind him, Ashton Kirk had a vague impression of something huge, made of steel rods and with far-stretching wing-like projections at the sides. But he had no time to give the mechanism even a glance. Of greater interest was the small figure which sat at a wide work table upon which a litter of drawings was scattered. It was Locke. And as the slight jar of the closing door reached him, he lifted his eyes and saw the intruder. If Ashton Kirk expected any display of fear or other emotion, he was disappointed. Upon each of his previous meetings with Locke, the latter had shown great trepidation. But now he simply nodded quietly and seemed not at all surprised. But as Ashton Kirk made a step toward him and raised his hand in a gesture that was peremptory and unmistakable, the investigator paused. Then Locke pointed to a chair directly before his bench, but some half dozen yards away. And when Ashton Kirk smilingly seated himself, Locke did likewise. Then in heavy characters he scrawled upon the back of one of the blueprints: "I was expecting a visitor, and fancied that it might be you." This he held up so that the investigator might read it. Ashton Kirk nodded. Again the back of a plan came into service, and this time the investigator read: "What has occurred is most unfortunate. I had no hand in it, though, of course, I do not expect anyone to believe me." Here Ashton Kirk drew a notebook from his pocket and was about to write, but the other stopped him with a gesture. Then the man wrote once more, carefully, heavily, in order that the other might have no difficulty in reading it from the distance. "Pardon me, but it is not necessary for you to go to any trouble. Moreover, I beg of you not to think me rude. Your opinions in the matter have no interest for me." Ashton Kirk acknowledged this with a grave nod. The pencil was instantly at work again. "As I have said, I expected a visitor. But I will now add that I did not expect to be here to receive him." Ashton Kirk looked swiftly into Locke's face as he read this. The expression was unmistakable, and the investigator leaped to his feet. But the mute uttered a strange parrot-like cry, evidently the same that Edyth heard that night in Christie Place. And Ashton Kirk saw his hand go swiftly to a button at one side of the workbench. Instantly the investigator paused. Once more a gesture bade him be seated. Slowly he obeyed, and once more Locke began to trace bold characters upon the stiff paper. This message read: "You are a wise man. I had arranged everything before you came in, and had sat down to make an end of it. This button at my hand once started an electric apparatus, but now it is connected with a quantity of an explosive. My own invention, and a terrible one. Believe me, one touch, and everything in this building is in fragments." Ashton Kirk, when he had finished reading, nodded quietly. Again the mute began to write. "I have no ill will toward you," the words ran. "You have 2 minutes to leave here, and get safely away." When he saw that this had been read, Locke threw down the paper and took out his watch. Then he pointed toward the door and sat waiting. It was strange to see the little man sitting there calmly, with only the pressure of a finger between him and eternity. But Ashton Kirk knew stern resolution too well to mistake the look on the mute's face. There was nothing to do but to obey. He waved his hand in a farewell. Locke returned the gesture. Then Ashton Kirk walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out. Pendleton, patiently watching among the trees, saw him emerge and at once moved toward him. To his amazement, the investigator took him by the arm and broke into a run. "What the deuce is the matter now?" asked Pendleton, after they had passed the gate and were racing down the road. "You'll know in a few moments," returned Ashton Kirk grimly. He permitted no pause until they reached the car, the engine of which had not been stopped. "Quick, for your lives!" he ordered as he leaped in. Pendleton and Burgess followed instantly. The car had scarcely begun its plunge forward when a horrible rending shock staggered them. And as they sped away, the debris of the deaf-mute's workshop was falling all about them. The evening papers were glaring with the news from Cordova by the time the two friends were once more alone in Ashton Kirk's library. Pendleton seemed to be pondering. "I say," said he at last, "was it Morris or Spatola who remained at Hume's the night of the murder?"
"I spoke to Spatola about that," answered Ashton Kirk. "He said it was Morris who left first, and whom Hume pursued by jeers through the open window. Morris had, according to his resolve, called at the place to demand the plans. But Hume was mad with liquor, and was even worse in his manner than usual. Unable to bear it, Morris had rushed out. Spatola later made his way out by way of the scuttle and across the roof, as he frequently did. The thing which Spatola had carried under his coat that night was a diploma which he had received from a musical conservatory in Rome. It was in a frame, and so made considerable bulk. Hume had denied that afternoon that Spatola had ever studied in this particular conservatory. Frantic with rage, but knowing that he was a fool for doing it, the Italian had brought his diploma as proof. Morris, under the name of Crawford, occupied a room on the floor below Spatola, and as soon as the musician entered through the scuttle, he descended the stairs and went immediately to his friend's room to console and encourage him. Some time passed, and while they were still talking, they heard a step upon the stairs leading to the attic. As no one lived there but himself, Spatola looked, and in the semi-darkness saw two men descending. He called and asked who they were, and Sagon's voice replied that it was he and a friend. They had gone up to have a talk and smoke a cigar with him. But seeing that he was not in, they had come down at once. And now, as he was apparently engaged, they would not trouble him, and with that they disappeared within Sagon's room.
"Then," said Pendleton, "they had gone up through the attic, across the roofs, committed the deed, and returned while Spatola was with Morris?"
"It would seem so."
"But suppose that on reaching the attic, upon their return they had found Spatola there?"
Sagon had calculated it all very nicely. One night a week Spatola went to play with two compatriots at their rooms. With piano, harp and violin, they gave vent to the harmony that was in them. That was the night for the trio, and Sagon knew it. But in his rage and his desire to prove his standing to Hume, Spatola had forgotten it. When he descended to Morris's rooms,
The two criminals thought he had gone to make his usual visit to his friends. Sagon says he almost lost his nerve when the Italian confronted them on the stairs. But here's a thing I've not been able to puzzle out. According to your notion, and you may have proved it since for all I know, Locke was not in the showroom during or after the murder. And yet, it should have been he who dropped the little particle from the railroad ticket upon the desk.
"It would seem that way," admitted Ashton Kirk. "But the fact is that Sagon visited Locke at the Institute, and rode to the city with him that afternoon. The particle may be accounted for in that way."
Yes, mused the other. That's so. But one thing more. I should have asked this of Morris himself, if he had not been in such a confoundedly miserable way. Why did he take to hiding immediately after the murder?
"He spent the night in his lodgings at Christie Place. Next day the papers told him that he was suspected. He knew that if he appeared, he'd be arrested. And as he desired to recover the plans before the murderers escaped with them, he felt that this would be fatal to his chances. Of course, I am not sure of this, but I think it more than likely."
"Speaking of taking chances on the plans," said Pendleton, "you were willing enough to take pretty long ones on them last night. Why, Sagon actually had them in his hands." Ashton Kirk drew a flat packet from his pocket. Opening it, he showed that it contained nothing but blank paper.
"This is what Sagon found behind the portrait," said he, with a smile. "The real papers I was very careful to remove 2 days ago. One moment, that's the telephone."
Pendleton sat rolling a cigarette and wondering, while Ashton Kirk took down the receiver.
"Well," said he.
Then in a moment his expression changed.
"Oh, is it you? Well, how are you after your exciting experience?"
Here Pendleton dropped the completed cigarette and listened.
"You may consider yourself very fortunate to escape with a slight headache," said Ashton Kirk. Then there was a pause, and he said, apparently in answer to a question, "Oh, yes, he's with me now. Will you speak with him?"
Pendleton arose and took a step toward the stand. But he halted as if shot when his friend continued in the transmitter.
"No?"
Pause.
"Oh, very well. Goodbye."
Ashton Kirk hung up the receiver and turned to his friend. "So," said Pendleton in a queer sort of voice, "she doesn't wish to speak to me?"
"Not over the wire, no. But she wants you to come to her. At once. She desires to hear all about what she calls the wonderful way we have handled this case. And she wants to hear it from you."
Ashton Kirk looked at his watch.
"It is now 10:45. You can get there by 11 if you rush."
"Do you call doing that little distance in 15 minutes rushing?" The young man's face was radiant, and he was making for the door as he spoke. "If I don't do it in half that time, I'm a duffer." Then the door slapped behind him, and Ashton Kirk heard him bounding down the stairs. End of chapter 26. Recording by Pete Milan. End of Ashton Kirk, Investigator, by John Thomas McIntyre.